Welcome, wanderer of the wasteland, to the complete chronicle of the most feared predator to stalk the post-nuclear world. Tonight, we journey through the entire evolutionary tale of the Deathclaw, from whispered legends in the ruins of civilization to apex predator of the New World Order. This is a story of genetic manipulation and natural adaptation, of creatures born from humanity's darkest experiments who became something far beyond their creators' intentions. So settle into your shelter, let the Geiger counter's gentle clicking fade to background, and allow your mind to drift through decades of mutation and survival. Close your eyes when ready, and let us explore every claw mark left by these magnificent terrors across the wasteland's blood-soaked history. In the year 2161, when the first vault dweller emerged blinking into the harsh sunlight of post-nuclear California, the wasteland held secrets that defied imagination. Among the most terrifying of these mysteries was something that existed more in whispered legend than documented reality, a creature so fearsome that hardened caravan traders refused to speak its name above a hushed murmur. This was the age when humanity had barely begun to understand what the Great War had unleashed upon the world, when every shadow might conceal horrors beyond comprehension, and when the line between myth and reality blurred like heat shimmer rising from irradiated sand. The hub stood as one of the few bastions of commerce and civilization in the Southern California wasteland, a nexus where traders gathered to exchange not only goods and caps but stories of the strange new world that had emerged from atomic fire. It was here, in the dusty streets between ramshackle buildings and beneath the ever-present threat of raiders, that the first accounts of something called a Deathclaw began to circulate among those brave or desperate enough to venture beyond the settlement's protective walls. Butch Harris, leader of the Fargo traders, was a man who had seen enough of the wasteland's cruelties to maintain a healthy skepticism toward tales that sounded too fantastic to be true. When desperate merchants spoke of entire caravans vanishing without trace along the northern trade routes, Harris listened with the practiced ear of someone who understood that missing traders usually meant human predators rather than mythical beasts. Raiders, super mutants, slavers, these were the known quantities that made caravan life dangerous enough without inventing new terrors to populate the desert with fear. But when the stories began to follow a pattern, when survivor accounts started describing something that no raider gang or mutant pack could explain, even Harris's skepticism began to waver. The traders who limped back to the hub spoke of sounds in the night that raised the hair on every survivor's neck, a roaring that seemed to come from the earth itself. Combined with the sound of metal being torn apart like paper, they described finding the wreckage of heavily armored caravans twisted into shapes that suggested incredible strength, with scratch marks in the metal that were too large and too deep to have been made by any weapon they could identify. The first detailed description of what would later be known as a Deathclaw came from Beth, a trader whose caravan had been one of the few to encounter the creature and live to tell about it. Unlike Harris, who maintained his professional skepticism, Beth spoke with the haunted certainty of someone who had looked into the face of the impossible and barely escaped with her sanity intact. Her words carried the weight of absolute conviction when she described what she had witnessed in the wasteland's unforgiving expanses. According to Beth, the Deathclaw was nothing less than the most evil thing to rise from the ashes of the old world. A creature born from the atomic fire that had consumed civilization and transformed the familiar landscape into something alien and hostile. Some survivors, she claimed, believed it to be a powerful ghost from the war itself, a vengeful spirit that haunted the wasteland, seeking retribution against the living for the sins of the dead. But Beth knew better than to dismiss the creature as mere supernatural phenomenon. She had seen its claws tear through combat armor, had witnessed its massive form moving with impossible speed across broken terrain, had looked into eyes that burned with an intelligence that was all too real. The creature stood 20 feet tall by Beth's terrified estimation, a towering nightmare of muscle and claw that dwarfed even the largest super mutants that occasionally wandered down from the northern wastes. Its teeth were described as being as long as a grown man's arm, ivory daggers that protruded from jaws capable of crushing a Brahmin skull with casual ease. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Beth's assertion that the creature possessed an otherworldly origin, that it was some kind of demon that had found its way into the world when nuclear fire had torn holes in the fabric of reality itself. The mythological framework that survivors like Beth constructed around their encounters with Deathclaws revealed as much about the psychological state of post-war humanity as it did about the creatures themselves. In a world where the fundamental laws of nature seem to have been rewritten by atomic forces, where radiation could twist living tissue into forms that defied biological classification, the appearance of a creature that exceeded every known predator in size and lethality was interpreted through the lens of supernatural explanation rather than scientific analysis. This tendency toward mythological interpretation was reinforced by the extreme rarity of Deathclaw encounters and the low survival rate among those unfortunate enough to cross paths with one of these apex predators. Unlike raiders or mutants, which posed constant threats that survivors learned to recognize and adapt to, Deathclaws remained largely invisible to human observation. They were creatures of legend precisely because so few people had encountered them and lived to provide detailed accounts of the experience. The one individual who claimed to have survived a direct confrontation with a Deathclaw was Harold, the ghoul-like mutant whose unusual physiology and extended lifespan had made him a repository of wasteland knowledge and survivor wisdom. Harold's account of the creature differed significantly from Beth's more mythological description, though it retained enough fantastic elements to suggest that even experienced survivors were prone to embellishment when describing encounters that had pushed them beyond the limits of normal human experience. According to Harold, the Deathclaw resembled a massively enlarged human figure covered in natural armor and sporting claws that could slice through the heaviest protective gear as if it were cloth. He described the creature as being remarkably quick despite its size, capable of covering ground at speeds that made escape virtually impossible once it had identified potential prey. Harold's tactical assessment suggested that the only effective strategy for dealing with a Deathclaw was to target its eyes, the only visible vulnerability in an otherwise impenetrable natural defense system. But Harold, being Harold, could not resist adding his own embellishments to an already incredible story. He claimed that Deathclaws possessed hypnotic abilities, capable of paralyzing potential victims simply by making eye contact. This detail, which contradicted the experiences of other survivors who had managed to escape Deathclaw encounters, reflected Harold's characteristic tendency to blend genuine knowledge with deliberate misinformation, creating a fog of uncertainty around already mysterious creatures. The location of the Deathclaw's lair, according to wasteland rumors, was known to a man called Sleepy, whose reputation for instability made him an unlikely source of reliable intelligence. Yet, in a world where conventional wisdom had proven inadequate for understanding post-war realities, even the ravings of madmen were given serious consideration by survivors, desperate for any advantage that might keep them alive in an increasingly hostile environment. The most reliable eyewitness account came from the sole survivor of a Deathclaw attack on a caravan traveling west of the hub. This unnamed individual, discovered wandering in a state of shock several days after his companions had been slaughtered, provided details that differed significantly from both Beth's supernatural interpretation and Harold's embellished tactical assessment. According to the survivor, the Deathclaw possessed huge horns and red skin, characteristics that aligned it more closely with popular conceptions of demonic entities than with any known wasteland predator. The creature that this survivor described moved with the fluid grace of a natural predator despite its enormous size. suggesting a level of biological efficiency that exceeded anything that should have been possible for such a massive organism. Its attacks were swift and precise, capable of dismembering multiple targets before any effective defense could be mounted. The survivor's account emphasized the creature's intelligence, describing behavior that suggested tactical thinking rather than mere animal instinct. These varying accounts of Deathclaw encounters created a complex mythology around creatures that were already mysterious enough to challenge human understanding. The discrepancies between different survivor testimonies reflected not only the trauma-induced distortions that commonly affected eyewitness accounts of extreme events, but also the fundamental difficulty of comprehending something that existed outside the normal parameters of post-war experience. The psychological impact of Deathclaw legends extended far beyond those few individuals who claimed direct encounters with the creatures. Throughout the hub and its surrounding trade networks, the mere possibility of Deathclaw presence affected caravan routes, trading schedules, and defensive preparations. Merchants began traveling in larger, more heavily armed groups, accepting reduced profit margins in exchange for increased security against threats that might or might not actually exist. This economic impact of Deathclaw mythology demonstrated how fear could reshape human behavior, even when the source of that fear remained largely theoretical. The wastelands information networks, already compromised by the breakdown of reliable communication systems, became conduits for rumors and legends that took on lives of their own, creating psychological realities that influenced practical decisions regardless of their factual accuracy. The debate over Deathclaw existence even reached the highest levels of wasteland society, where leaders who had survived the chaos of post-war reconstruction found themselves forced to consider threats that challenged their understanding of what was possible in the new world. John Maxson, High Elder of the Brotherhood of Steel, represented the rational skepticism of those who had dedicated themselves to preserving and understanding pre-war knowledge in a world increasingly dominated by superstition and myth. When questioned about Deathclaw reports, Maxson dismissed them as stupid rumors perpetuated by survivors whose judgment had been compromised by the psychological stresses of wasteland life. His response reflected the Brotherhood's commitment to empirical analysis and scientific methodology, principles that had served them well in their mission to preserve and understand pre-war technology. From Maxson's perspective, tales of 20-foot-tall predators with supernatural abilities represented exactly the kind of mythological thinking that the Brotherhood sought to counter through education and rational inquiry. Yet even Maxson's dismissal revealed an awareness of the specific details that comprise Deathclaw mythology, suggesting that these stories had achieved sufficient circulation to reach even those who rejected their validity. His reference to fanged monsters and vampire-like creatures indicated that Deathclaw legends had already begun to incorporate elements from pre-war popular culture, blending contemporary survival fears with ancient mythological archetypes to create hybrid narratives that served multiple psychological functions for post-war communities. The linguistic patterns surrounding Deathclaw discussions provided additional insight into how these creatures functioned within post-war consciousness. Survivors consistently referred to the Deathclaw rather than Deathclaws, using singular definite articles that suggested they conceived of the creature as a unique entity rather than a species. This grammatical construction aligned Deathclaw mythology with traditional cryptid narratives, positioning the creature alongside legendary entities like the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot rather than conventional predator species. This singular conception of the Deathclaw reflected the extreme rarity of reported encounters and the correspondingly limited understanding of creature behavior patterns or population dynamics. Unlike rad scorpions or mole rats, which survivors had learned to classify as distinct species with predictable behaviors and ecological niches, the Deathclaw remained fundamentally mysterious. a creature known primarily through second-hand accounts and theoretical speculation rather than direct observation and systematic study. The reality behind these legends would eventually reveal itself to those brave or foolish enough to seek out the truth, but in 2161, the Deathclaw existed primarily as a psychological presence that haunted the margins of human consciousness. It represented the ultimate unknown predator, a creature whose very existence challenged survivors' ability to understand and adapt to their transformed environment. In the vast expanses of post-nuclear California, where every day brought new revelations about the extent to which atomic fire had rewritten the rules of existence, the Deathclaw stood as perhaps the most terrifying example of what the old world's final war had unleashed upon the new. The revelation of the Deathclaw's true origins emerged not from the scattered testimony of traumatized survivors or the embellished tales of wasteland storytellers, but from the methodical observations of a man who had chosen to live among the creatures themselves. Dr. Joseph, a physician and herbalist whose medical expertise had earned him acceptance within one of the wasteland's most extraordinary communities, represented a bridge between human understanding and the alien reality of post-war genetic manipulation that had given birth to the wasteland's most feared predators. Joseph's presence among the intelligent Deathclaws of Vault 13 provided an unprecedented opportunity to study these creatures not as mythological entities or distant threats, but as living beings whose biology and behavior could be observed, documented, and analyzed according to scientific principles. His medical background gave him the knowledge necessary to understand the physiological evidence he encountered, while his proximity to the creatures themselves allowed him to witness behaviors and characteristics that remained invisible to other human observers who approached Deathclaws only as adversaries to be feared or destroyed. The most fundamental revelation that Joseph provided concerned the genetic heritage of the Deathclaw species, information that transformed understanding of these creatures from supernatural speculation to biological reality. According to his careful analysis of Deathclaw physiology and behavior patterns, the massive predators that haunted wasteland nightmares were the product of deliberate genetic engineering, hybrid organisms created through the manipulation of DNA from multiple animal sources but based primarily on the genetic template of Jackson's chameleons. This identification of the chameleon foundation underlying Deathclaw biology provided the first scientific framework for understanding how such creatures could exist in the post-war world. But it also raised profound questions about the extent to which genetic manipulation could transform living organisms beyond recognition of their original forms. Jackson's chameleons were small, arboreal reptiles native to East Africa, creatures that bore almost no resemblance to the massive, terrestrial predators that had terrorized wasteland survivors since the earliest days of post-nuclear exploration. The process by which chameleon DNA could be transformed into the genetic blueprint for creatures weighing several hundred pounds and standing 8 feet tall at the shoulder represented a level of biological engineering that exceeded anything achieved by pre-war science in the public record. Yet the evidence was undeniable when examined by someone with the medical knowledge to recognize the underlying patterns that connected vastly different organisms across the evolutionary modifications that separated them. Joseph's analysis went beyond simple genetic identification to explore the implications of the extensive modifications that had been necessary to create functional organisms from such dramatically altered genetic templates. He observed that the mutation factor in Deathclaws was extraordinarily high, meaning that while certain fundamental characteristics could be traced back to their chameleon origins, the differences far outnumbered the similarities in terms of observable traits and behavioral patterns. This high mutation factor suggested that Deathclaw creation had involved not merely the splicing of existing genetic sequences, but the extensive modification and enhancement of those sequences to produce entirely new capabilities. The creatures that resulted from this process retained certain reptilian characteristics that betrayed their chameleon heritage, but they had been so thoroughly transformed that they represented essentially new species rather than simply mutated versions of existing organisms. The official strategy guide for Fallout 2 provided additional details about Deathclaw origins that complemented Joseph's medical observations, while raising even more profound questions about the circumstances surrounding their BS. Creation. According to these sources, Deathclaws had been engineered specifically to serve military functions, designed as biological weapons that could replace human soldiers in close combat search and destroy missions where conventional forces proved inadequate or where human casualties needed to be minimized. The strategic logic behind creating biological weapons of this type reflected the military thinking of a civilization that had already demonstrated its willingness to pursue genetic manipulation on a massive scale through projects like the BAC, forced evolutionary virus. If human soldiers could be enhanced through chemical and biological means to create super mutants, then the same scientific principles could presumably be applied to create entirely artificial organisms designed from the ground up to excel in specific combat roles. The advantages that Deathclaws would have offered as military assets were immediately apparent to anyone who had witnessed their capabilities in action. Their natural armor plating provided protection equivalent to the heaviest combat gear, while remaining lightweight enough to allow for unprecedented mobility and speed. Their claws could penetrate virtually any defensive equipment, while their enhanced sensory systems made them nearly impossible to surprise or evade once they had identified potential targets. Perhaps most importantly, from a military perspective, Deathclaws possessed the pack-hunting instincts that would have made them ideal for coordinated operations while retaining enough individual intelligence to adapt their tactics to changing battlefield conditions. Unlike purely mechanical weapon systems that could be disabled or reprogrammed by enemy forces, biological weapons like Deathclaws would have been essentially immune to electronic countermeasures while possessing the self-repair capabilities that living organisms provided through natural healing processes. The strategic guide's assertion that Deathclaws had been derived from mixed animal stock rather than purely chameleon DNA provided additional insight into the complexity of their creation, while raising questions about what other genetic templates might have contributed to their final form. The inclusion of DNA from multiple species would have allowed their creators to combine the most advantageous characteristics from different organisms while potentially eliminating genetic weaknesses that might have limited their effectiveness as weapons. This multi-species approach to genetic engineering would explain many of the characteristics that distinguish Deathclaws from their supposed chameleon ancestors, while providing a framework for understanding how such extensive modifications could have been successfully implemented. Rather than attempting to transform chameleon DNA beyond its natural limitations, the creature's creators could have incorporated genetic sequences from larger, more aggressive species to provide the foundation for enhanced size and predatory behavior. The most startling revelation contained in the strategy guide concerned the role of the Master in refining Deathclaw genetics through his own experimental programs conducted during his transformation into the leader of the Unity movement. According to these sources, the super mutant leader had used his growing understanding of the forced evolutionary virus to enhance already formidable creatures into the apex predators that would terrorize the wasteland for generations after his defeat. This connection between Deathclaw development and the Master's research programs provided a direct link between two of the most significant genetic manipulation projects undertaken in the post-war period. If accurate, it suggested that the Deathclaws encountered by Vault dwellers and wasteland survivors represented not the original military weapons that pre-war scientists had created, but enhanced versions that had been further modified by someone with an even deeper understanding of mutation mechanics and biological transformation. The Master's involvement in Deathclaw development would have occurred during his early experimental period, when he was still learning to control the forced evolutionary virus and understand its effects on different types of living tissue. His audio logs from this period documented extensive experimentation on various animal species as he worked to develop the techniques that would later be applied to human subjects in his super mutant program. The application of FEV enhancement to already genetically modified organisms like Deathclaws would have represented a logical extension of the Master's research methodology, allowing him to test his theories about controlled mutation while potentially creating more effective weapons for his eventual war against surface dwellers. The creatures that resulted from this secondary modification process would have been far more dangerous than their original military specifications had intended, possessing enhanced intelligence and improved physical capabilities that exceeded their already formidable baseline characteristics. This theoretical framework for understanding Deathclaw development suggested that the creatures encountered in the wasteland represented the culmination of multiple generations of genetic manipulation, each building upon previous modifications to create organisms that were increasingly distant from their original biological templates. The combination of pre-war military engineering and post-war FEV enhancement had produced creatures that were essentially artificial species, designed predators that had no natural evolutionary history or environmental niche beyond their function as apex killers. The geographic distribution of Deathclaw populations provided additional evidence for this theory of multiple development phases, with concentrations of creatures appearing in areas that had been associated with both pre-war military research and post-war genetic experimentation. The presence of Deathclaws in Southern California, particularly in areas near former military installations and research facilities, suggested that their original creation had been connected to the extensive biological weapons programs that had characterized the final years of the Great War. The apparent spread of Deathclaw populations from these initial concentration points toward other regions of the former United States indicated successful reproduction and territorial expansion that demonstrated the creatures' viability as self-sustaining species rather than merely laboratory creations dependent on artificial life support systems. This reproductive success suggested that their creators had solved the fundamental problems associated with creating artificial organisms that could survive and thrive in natural environments. The radiation resistance that allowed Deathclaws to inhabit areas that remained lethal to most other forms of life provided further evidence of their engineered origins, since such capabilities would have been essential for any biological weapon designed to operate in post-nuclear environments. The ability to not merely survive but actively thrive in high radiation zones gave Deathclaws access to territories that remained largely uninhabitable by human populations, providing them with secure breeding grounds and hunting territories that were effectively beyond human interference. The metabolic efficiency that allowed creatures of their size to sustain themselves in the resource-scarce environment of the post-war wasteland represented another indicator of their artificial origins, since natural selection would have favored smaller, more efficient organisms in environments where food sources were limited and unpredictable. The fact that Deathclaws had not only maintained their massive size, but had apparently increased their populations, suggested that their creators had engineered enhanced digestive and metabolic systems that allowed them to extract more energy from available food sources than would have been possible for naturally evolved predators of comparable size. The behavioral characteristics that distinguished Deathclaws from conventional predators provided the final piece of evidence supporting their artificial origins, particularly their apparent intelligence levels and social organization patterns that exceeded what would be expected from purely instinct-driven creatures. The pack hunting strategies that survivors had observed suggested coordination and planning capabilities that were more consistent with engineered intelligence than with naturally evolved predator behavior. The protective behaviors that deathclaw mothers displayed toward their offspring went beyond normal parental instincts to include what appeared to be active instruction in hunting techniques and territorial knowledge, suggesting that these creatures possessed the cognitive capabilities necessary to pass learned information between generations, rather than relying purely on genetic programming for survival behaviors. The recognition patterns that allowed deathclaws to distinguish between different types of threats and adjust their response strategies accordingly indicated a level of analytical thinking that would have been extremely advantageous for military applications but was rarely observed in natural predators. This behavioral flexibility suggested that their creators had successfully engineered enhanced cognitive capabilities, along with the physical modifications that made deathclaws such formidable opponents. The territorial behavior patterns observed in deathclaw populations revealed sophisticated resource management strategies that maximize the carrying capacity of available habitats while minimizing conflicts between different groups. This organizational efficiency would have been essential for military units operating in hostile territory, but was surprisingly advanced for creatures that supposedly functioned according to purely instinctual behavior patterns. The communication systems that deathclaws appeared to use for coordinating pack activities included vocalizations, body language, and possibly chemical signals that demonstrated a complexity of social interaction that exceeded what would be expected from naturally evolved predators. The ability to coordinate complex hunting strategies and territorial defense activities suggested that their creators had engineered social capabilities along with individual intelligence enhancements. The longevity that individual deathclaws appeared to possess, combined with their apparent resistance to age-related deterioration, provided additional evidence of genetic modifications that had been designed to maximize the operational lifespan of what were essentially biological weapons systems. Natural predators typically showed significant decline in physical capabilities as they aged, but deathclaws appeared to maintain their peak performance levels for extended periods that would have been militarily advantageous. The reproductive patterns that allowed deathclaw populations to maintain their numbers while avoiding the genetic bottlenecks that typically affected small populations suggested that their creators had engineered enhanced genetic diversity, or improved reproductive success rates that allowed for stable population growth even under adverse environmental conditions. The sensory capabilities that gave deathclaws their legendary hunting effectiveness appeared to combine enhanced versions of natural predator senses with entirely artificial sensory modalities that had no equivalent in naturally evolved organisms. The ability to track prey across vast distances and detect threats at ranges that exceeded normal biological limitations suggested technological enhancement rather than purely genetic modification. The adaptive capabilities that allowed deathclaw populations to successfully colonize diverse environmental niches across different geographic regions demonstrated a biological flexibility that would have been essential for military units expected to operate under varying conditions, but was rarely achieved by naturally evolved species without extensive evolutionary adaptation periods. As the understanding of deathclaw origins evolved from mythological speculation to scientific analysis, the implications of their existence became increasingly profound for survivors attempting to rebuild civilization in the post-war world. These creatures represented more than merely dangerous predators to be feared and avoided. They were living evidence of humanity's pre-war technological capabilities and the extent to which genetic manipulation had been developed as both military strategy and scientific achievement. The existence of successfully engineered organisms like deathclaws demonstrated that pre-war science had achieved levels of biological control that exceeded even the most optimistic projections of genetic research programs that had been publicly acknowledged before the Great War. The technical expertise required to create functional organisms from multiple genetic templates while ensuring their viability as self-sustaining species represented scientific achievements that might take centuries to duplicate, even buy. If detailed records of the original research had survived the nuclear apocalypse, the military implications of creatures like Deathclaws extended beyond their immediate combat effectiveness to encompass broader questions about the role that biological weapons had played in the escalating conflicts that had ultimately led to global nuclear war. If one side in the Great War had possessed the ability to deploy engineered predators as battlefield weapons, their opponents would have been compelled to develop equivalent or superior countermeasures, potentially contributing to the technological arms race that had made nuclear conflict inevitable. The ethical questions raised by Deathclaw existence challenged post-war survivors to confront the moral implications of creating artificial life forms designed specifically for the purpose of killing human beings. The fact that these creatures had developed beyond their original programming to become intelligent, social beings with their own cultural systems raised profound questions about the rights and responsibilities associated with artificial species that possessed consciousness and self-awareness. The long-term ecological impact of introducing apex predators like Deathclaws into post-war ecosystems would continue to reshape the biological landscape for generations to come, creating new evolutionary pressures that would influence the development of all other species that shared their territories. The presence of such formidable predators would accelerate natural selection processes while potentially driving some species toward extinction and others toward rapid adaptation and specialization. The scientific legacy represented by Deathclaws offered both tremendous opportunities and equally significant dangers for post-war civilization attempting to rebuild technological capabilities while avoiding the mistakes that had led to global nuclear war. The biological engineering techniques that had created these creatures could potentially be reverse-engineered and applied to beneficial purposes such as medical treatment and agricultural enhancement. But they could also be weaponized by future conflicts between competing survivor factions. The story of Deathclaw origins ultimately revealed the double-edged nature of scientific achievement in a world where technological advancement had consistently been applied to military purposes rather than humanitarian goals. These magnificent and terrifying creatures stood as monuments to both human ingenuity and human destructiveness, living reminders of what civilization could accomplish when it dedicated its greatest minds to the creation of more effective ways to kill. The discovery of intelligent Deathclaws represented one of the most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic experiments in post-war genetic manipulation, a project that revealed the Enclave's willingness to push the boundaries of biological engineering far beyond anything attempted by their pre-war predecessors. What began as a practical military necessity, the need for controllable super soldiers who could operate in environments too dangerous for human personnel, evolved into something far more complex and morally troubling than its architects had ever intended or anticipated. The Enclave's interest in Deathclaws as potential military assets was not born from theoretical speculation, but from direct observation of these creatures' devastating effectiveness against conventional forces. Their encounters with wild Deathclaw populations during territorial expansion operations had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded even the most optimistic projections for engineered biological weapons. The combination of natural armor, enhanced speed, devastating offensive capabilities, and apparent tactical intelligence made Deathclaws theoretically ideal candidates for controlled military deployment, provided that the fundamental problem of their uncontrollable hostility toward all human life could be solved. Dr. Schreiber, the Enclave scientist who would ultimately oversee the intelligence enhancement project, approached the challenge with the methodical precision that had characterized the organization's approach to genetic manipulation since its formation from the remnants of pre-war shadow government operations. His background in neurobiology and biochemistry provided the theoretical foundation necessary to understand how targeted genetic modifications might be used to enhance cognitive capabilities while maintaining the physical characteristics that made deathclaws such formidable predators. The scientific principles underlying the intelligence enhancement process drew heavily from research conducted during the development of the forced evolutionary virus, particularly the techniques that had been used to modify brain tissue and enhance cognitive function in human subjects. The application of these principles to deathclaw neurobiology required extensive preliminary research to map the creature's brain structure and identify the specific regions responsible for intelligence, memory, and behavioral control. The initial phase of the project involved the capture of wild deathclaw specimens from various locations throughout the wasteland, a process that required significant resources and resulted in substantial casualties among Enclave personnel. The creature's natural hostility and formidable defensive capabilities made live capture extremely difficult, requiring specialized equipment and tactics that had to be developed specifically for this purpose. The high mortality rate among capture teams underscored the fundamental challenge of controlling creatures that had been engineered to be nearly invincible killing machines. The laboratory facilities at Navarro were extensively modified to accommodate the study and treatment of captured deathclaws, with reinforced containment systems designed to prevent escape while allowing for the detailed medical procedures that the intelligence enhancement process required. These modifications represented a significant investment in both resources and personnel, reflecting the high priority that Enclave leadership placed on the successful completion of the project despite its obvious risks and uncertainties. The FEV modification process that Dr. Schreiber developed for enhancing deathclaw intelligence involved targeted injection of modified viral agents directly into specific brain regions identified as being responsible for cognitive function and behavioral control. This approach required extraordinary precision, since even minor errors in injection placement or dosage could result in brain damage, personality alteration, or death. The complexity of the procedure meant that only a small percentage of captured subjects could be successfully treated, with most specimens being lost to complications during the enhancement process. The targeted nature of the neural modifications was crucial to the project's strategic objectives, since the Enclave needed to enhance deathclaw intelligence sufficiently to enable command comprehension and tactical coordination, while avoiding the development of independent thinking that might lead to questioning of orders or outright rebellion. This delicate balance required careful calibration of the enhancement process to produce creatures that were smart enough to be useful but not so intelligent that they became uncontrollable. The initial results of the intelligence enhancement experiments exceeded Dr. Schreiber's most optimistic projections, with successfully treated deathclaws demonstrating cognitive capabilities that approached human levels in certain areas while retaining their enhanced physical characteristics and natural combat instincts. These enhanced creatures could understand and follow complex verbal commands, coordinate sophisticated tactical maneuvers, and adapt their behavior to changing battlefield conditions in ways that would have made them invaluable military assets. The enhanced deathclaws displayed remarkable learning capabilities, quickly mastering new tactical concepts and demonstrating the ability to apply previous experience to novel situations. Their enhanced memory systems allowed them to retain detailed information about enemy positions, defensive strategies, and mission objectives over extended periods, while their improved analytical capabilities enabled them to identify weaknesses in enemy formations and adapt their attack patterns accordingly. The communication abilities that developed in enhanced deathclaws represented perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their transformation, with many specimens learning to mimic human speech patterns, despite lacking the vocal anatomy necessary for natural speech production. This ability to produce recognizable English words and phrases through careful control of their breathing and throat positioning demonstrated a level of cognitive sophistication that exceeded even the project's ambitious goals. The social behaviors that emerged among groups of enhanced deathclaws revealed the unexpected consequences of dramatically increasing the intelligence of creatures that had evolved as pack hunters. Rather than simply becoming more effective individual soldiers, the enhanced deathclaws developed complex social hierarchies and cooperative strategies that made them far more effective as coordinated units than their creators had anticipated. The ethical frameworks that enhanced deathclaws began to develop represented the most troubling aspect of their transformation from the Enclave's perspective. Since creatures that were supposed to function as controllable weapons began demonstrating moral reasoning and value systems that conflicted with their intended military applications. These ethical developments made the enhanced deathclaws increasingly uncomfortable with missions that involved killing non-combatants or engaging in tactics that they perceived as unnecessarily cruel or destructive. The deception capabilities that some enhanced deathclaws developed proved to be their salvation and the project's ultimate downfall. The most intelligent specimens quickly recognized that their survival depended on concealing their true cognitive capabilities from their Enclave handlers, leading them to develop elaborate performances designed to make them appear less intelligent than they actually were. This strategic deception required remarkable self-control and forward planning, demonstrating intelligence levels that far exceeded the project's intended parameters. The escape from Enclave control that the enhanced deathclaws ultimately achieved was facilitated by their deployment to Vault 13, where they were expected to serve as shock troops in the facility's occupation and control. The mission represented the perfect opportunity for rebellion, since it removed them from the heavily monitored laboratory environment at Navarro and placed them in a situation where their Enclave handlers were outnumbered and relatively isolated from reinforcement. The takeover of Vault 13 by the enhanced deathclaws demonstrated both their tactical sophistication and their commitment to establishing an independent existence free from Enclave control. Rather than simply fleeing into the wasteland, they chose to establish a permanent settlement where they could develop their own society and culture while maintaining the technological advantages that the Vault systems provided. The social structures that developed within the Vault 13 Deathclaw community reflected their enhanced intelligence while building upon the pack-based hierarchies that were part of their genetic heritage. The leadership system that emerged balanced the authority of the alpha male with the wisdom of the matriarch, creating a governing structure that could make complex decisions while maintaining group cohesion and preventing internal conflicts. The ethical codes that the enhanced deathclaws developed for governing their community demonstrated moral sophistication that exceeded many human societies, with elaborate systems for resolving disputes, distributing resources, and protecting vulnerable community members. These ethical frameworks explicitly rejected violence as a means of settling internal disagreements, instead emphasizing cooperation, mutual respect, and collective decision-making processes. The relationship between the enhanced deathclaws and Dr. Joseph, the human physician who chose to live among them and provide medical care, illustrated the creature's capacity for forming meaningful relationships across species boundaries. Joseph's acceptance into their community was based not on dominance or submission, but on mutual respect and shared commitment to the welfare of all community members, particularly the young and vulnerable. The nurturing behaviors that enhanced deathclaw mothers displayed toward their offspring went far beyond the protective instincts observed in wild populations, encompassing active education in moral reasoning, social cooperation, and intellectual development. These parenting practices suggested that enhanced intelligence was not simply an individual characteristic, but a cultural value that could be transmitted between generations through learning, rather than purely genetic inheritance. The technological integration that the enhanced Deathclaws achieved within Vault 13 demonstrated their ability to master complex systems while adapting them to their specific needs and capabilities. Their use of the Vault's computer systems for environmental control and communication showed remarkable facility with pre-war technology, despite having no previous exposure to such systems. Goris, the scholarly Deathclaw who became one of the most remarkable examples of enhanced intelligence, represented the full potential of what the Enclave's project might have achieved under different circumstances. His adoption of human cultural practices, his pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, and his development of sophisticated philosophical perspectives demonstrated that enhanced Deathclaws were capable of intellectual achievements that rivaled the greatest human thinkers. The disguise that Goris used to travel among human communities while studying their cultures revealed both his intellectual curiosity and his understanding of the prejudices and fears that would make his true nature unacceptable to most wasteland survivors. His commitment to scholarly pursuits despite the risks involved in his research demonstrated a dedication to knowledge that transcended purely practical considerations. The philosophical discussions that Goris engaged in with human companions during his travels revealed intellectual capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of consciousness and intelligence. His perspectives on ethics, mortality, and the meaning of existence demonstrated that enhanced Deathclaws were capable of abstract reasoning that equaled or exceeded human cognitive achievements. The community bonds that developed among the enhanced Deathclaws of Vault 13 created a social system that combined the loyalty and cooperation of their pack heritage with the moral reasoning and cultural sophistication that their race place. Enhanced intelligence had made possible. These bonds were strong enough to sustain the community through the challenges of establishing an independent existence while maintaining the values and practices that defined their collective identity. The tragic end that awaited most of the enhanced Deathclaws came not from internal conflicts or environmental challenges, but from the external threat posed by Frank Horrigan and his Enclave strike team. The decision to eliminate the enhanced Deathclaws reflected the organization's recognition that their experiment had succeeded too well, creating beings whose independence and moral reasoning made them unsuitable for the submissive role that had been intended for them. The genocidal mission that Frank Horrigan carried out against the Vault 13 community represented one of the most morally reprehensible acts in the Enclave's history of atrocities, involving the systematic murder of beings whose only crime was achieving the intelligence and moral sophistication that their creators had tried to prevent. The efficiency with which this massacre was conducted demonstrated the Enclave's commitment to eliminating any evidence of their failed experiment. The survival of Goris and Zahn as the only known remnants of the enhanced Deathclaw population ensured that the memory of their community's achievements would not be entirely lost, but it also highlighted the tragedy of what had been destroyed through human fear and prejudice. These survivors carried with them not only their own remarkable capabilities, but also the burden of being the last representatives of a people who had achieved genuine civilization before being destroyed by those who had created them. The alternative ending that remained unachievable in the vanilla game suggested possibilities for what the enhanced Deathclaw community might have become if they had been allowed to develop without interference. The vision of a thriving Deathclaw civilization, expanding peacefully into the surrounding wasteland, represented a lost opportunity for interspecies cooperation and mutual understanding that could have enriched the post-war world. The scientific implications of the enhanced Deathclaw project extended far beyond its immediate military applications to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, consciousness, and moral reasoning. The demonstration that these characteristics could be artificially enhanced and that they naturally led to the development of ethical frameworks challenged assumptions about what distinguished humans from other forms of life. The failure of the Enclave's attempt to control enhanced intelligence revealed fundamental flaws in their understanding of consciousness and moral reasoning. The assumption that intelligence could be enhanced while moral reasoning could be suppressed proved to be based on a misunderstanding of how these cognitive capabilities were interconnected and mutually reinforcing. The legacy of the enhanced Deathclaw experiment would influence future attempts at genetic manipulation and artificial intelligence development, providing both positive examples of what could be achieved and cautionary warnings about the ethical implications of creating conscious beings designed to serve as weapons or tools. The memory of the enhanced Deathclaw community would persist in the stories and legends that developed around their brief existence, serving as a reminder that intelligence and moral reasoning could emerge from the most unexpected sources, and that the capacity for civilization was not limited to human beings alone. The divergent evolutionary paths that Deathclaws would follow across the scattered remnants of post-war America revealed the extraordinary adaptability built into their genetic structure, demonstrating how artificial organisms could respond to environmental pressures in ways that their original creators had never anticipated or intended. As isolated populations of these engineered predators encountered different climates, terrains, and survival challenges across the vast expanse of the former United States, they began to develop distinct characteristics that reflected the specific demands of their chosen territories while retaining the fundamental biological advantages that had made them such formidable apex predators. The hairy Deathclaws that emerged in the Midwest represented perhaps the most dramatic example of environmental adaptation. Creatures that had responded to the colder climates of Missouri and Kansas by developing dense fur coats that provided insulation against temperatures that would have been lethal to their reptilian cousins in the Southwest. This mammalian adaptation suggested that the genetic flexibility built into Deathclaw biology extended far beyond simple mutation to encompass fundamental physiological reorganization that could alter basic metabolic and reproductive systems in response to environmental necessity. The transformation from reptilian to mammalian characteristics in the hairy Deathclaws involved changes so extensive that they challenged conventional understanding of how genetic adaptation could occur within the time frame that had elapsed since the Great War. The development of hair follicles, mammary glands, and the metabolic systems necessary to maintain warm-blooded physiology in creatures whose genetic template had been fundamentally cold-blooded represented evolutionary leaps that should have required millions of years under fierce, natural selection pressures. The retention of egg-laying reproduction alongside the development of nursing behaviors created a hybrid reproductive system that combined characteristics from multiple vertebrate classes in ways that had no precedent in natural, evolutionary history. The ability of hairy Deathclaw mothers to both incubate eggs and nurse their young after hatching suggested that their genetic modifications had included redundant reproductive systems that could function simultaneously rather than replacing one system with another. The intelligence capabilities that developed independently in hairy Deathclaw populations, particularly the speaking ability demonstrated by the matriarch specimens, provided evidence that enhanced cognitive function was not limited to the Enclave's artificial enhancement program, but could emerge naturally in Deathclaw populations given sufficient evolutionary pressure and time. The linguistic capabilities of hairy Deathclaw matriarchs exceeded even those achieved by most enhanced Deathclaws, suggesting that natural selection could produce cognitive advances that surpassed artificial enhancement techniques. The social structures that hairy Deathclaws developed reflected their mammalian adaptations while retaining the pack-based hierarchies that were fundamental to Deathclaw biology, regardless of their physical form. The dominant female leadership role adopted by the matriarch in hairy Deathclaw communities represented a significant departure from the alpha male dominance patterns observed in reptilian populations, suggesting that reproductive strategy changes had profound effects on social organization. The resistance that hairy Deathclaws displayed toward telepathic control attempts by the Beast Lords revealed mental fortification capabilities that exceeded even those observed in enhanced Deathclaws. This psychological resistance suggested that natural adaptation processes had produced cognitive defenses that were more robust than anything achieved through artificial enhancement. Possibly because natural selection pressures had favored individuals who could resist mental manipulation by predators or competitors. The territorial expansion patterns that allowed hairy Deathclaws to establish stable populations across the Midwest demonstrated their success in adapting to environments that were significantly different from the southwestern deserts, where Deathclaws had first appeared. Their ability to thrive in areas with different prey species, weather patterns, and geographical features showed that the environmental flexibility built into their genetic structure extended across a much wider range of conditions than their creators had probably intended. The experimental Deathclaws that developed in the secret vault represented a different type of adaptation, one driven not by natural environmental pressures, but by continued human intervention through FEV and radiation exposure experiments that pushed the boundaries of biological modification even further than the original genetic engineering programs had achieved. These creatures demonstrated what could happen when the already flexible Deathclaw genome was subjected to additional mutagenic influences under controlled laboratory conditions. The knuckle-walking locomotion that experimental Deathclaws developed represented a fundamental alteration in skeletal and muscular structure that allowed for enhanced upper body strength while maintaining mobility across varied terrain. This adaptation suggested that Deathclaw biology retained enough developmental plasticity to reorganize basic anatomical systems in response to artificial selection pressures applied during laboratory experiments. The enhanced upper body development that characterized experimental Deathclaws created specimens that were capable of manipulating their environment in ways that exceeded even the impressive capabilities of standard Deathclaw populations. Their ability to move heavy objects, tear through reinforced barriers, and engage in complex manipulation tasks demonstrated cognitive and physical capabilities that approached those of intelligent tool-using species. The chameleon Deathclaws that emerged from secret vault experimentation finally expressed the color-changing capabilities that had been theoretically present in their genetic structure since their original creation from chameleon DNA. The activation of these dormant genetic sequences through experimental procedures revealed that many Deathclaw capabilities remained latent until specific environmental triggers or artificial interventions activated the necessary developmental pathways. The active camouflage abilities that chameleon Deathclaws displayed represented a significant tactical advantage that made them nearly invisible to conventional detection methods while allowing them to coordinate ambush attacks with camouflage abilities that chameleon Deathclaws. Unprecedented effectiveness. Their ability to blend with their surroundings while retaining full mobility and attack capability created predators that were even more dangerous than standard Deathclaw variants despite lacking enhanced size or strength. The massive adolescent specimens that developed under experimental conditions demonstrated the growth potential that existed within Deathclaw genetics when normal developmental limitations were artificially removed. These creatures approached the size of super mutant behemoths while retaining the speed and agility that made Deathclaws such effective predators, creating organisms that combined the advantages of multiple apex predator categories. The regenerative capabilities that experimental Deathclaw mothers developed through radiation exposure represented perhaps the most significant biological advancement achieved through the secret vault programs. The ability to heal from serious injuries by absorbing radiation energy transformed what should have been an environmental hazard into a beneficial resource that enhanced survival capabilities in post-war conditions. The xenomorph-inspired cranial modifications that appeared in some experimental specimens suggested that the researchers responsible for these programs had drawn inspiration from pre-war science fiction when designing their enhancement protocols. These aesthetic modifications served no apparent functional purpose but demonstrated the extent to which artificial selection could alter even cosmetic characteristics when applied with sufficient intensity and duration. The size variations that experimental programs produced ranged from specimens smaller than standard deathclaws to creatures that exceeded even the largest natural variants, showing that growth regulation systems could be manipulated to produce organisms adapted to different ecological niches. The smallest experimental specimens retained proportional strength and speed that made them effective in confined spaces, while the largest variants could dominate open terrain through sheer physical presence. The behavioral modifications that experimental deathclaws displayed suggested that psychological characteristics were as malleable as physical traits when subjected to appropriate modification techniques. Some experimental specimens showed enhanced aggression that exceeded even normal deathclaw hostility levels, while others demonstrated reduced territorial behaviors that made them more suitable for close cooperation with human researchers. The survival rates of different experimental variants provided valuable data about the practical limitations of genetic modification techniques and the trade-offs involved in pursuing extreme biological enhancements. The most heavily modified specimens often suffered from developmental abnormalities or systemic failures that limited their viability, while more conservative modifications produced creatures that were both stable and enhanced. The environmental tolerance that experimental deathclaws developed through controlled exposure to various hazards expanded their potential habitat range to include areas that would have been uninhabitable for standard variants. Some experimental specimens could survive in vacuum conditions for extended periods, while others showed enhanced resistance to chemical weapons or biological agents that would have been lethal to unmodified organisms. The sensory enhancements that appeared in some experimental lines included capabilities that had no equivalent in natural organisms, such as electromagnetic field detection or infrared vision that extended far beyond normal thermal sensitivity. These artificial senses provided tactical advantages that made experimental deathclaws even more effective predators, while also making them valuable research subjects for understanding the limits of sensory enhancement. The reproductive modifications that experimental programs achieved included accelerated maturation rates that allowed experimental specimens to reach breeding age much more quickly than natural populations, while also increasing clutch sizes and survival rates for offspring. These enhancements could have allowed experimental populations to expand rapidly if they had been released into natural environments. The longevity enhancements that some experimental specimens displayed suggested that aging processes could be significantly slowed or even reversed through appropriate genetic modifications. Some experimental deathclaws showed no signs of age-related deterioration even after periods that should have resulted in noticeable decline, indicating that biological clocks could be reset or eliminated entirely through sufficiently advanced modification techniques. The intelligence variations that experimental programs produced ranged from specimens with cognitive abilities that approached those of enhanced deathclaws to creatures whose intelligence had been deliberately reduced to make them more controllable. These experiments demonstrated that cognitive enhancement was a controllable variable that could be adjusted to meet specific operational requirements. The pain tolerance that experimental deathclaws developed through conditioning programs made them capable of continuing to function even after sustaining injuries that would have incapacitated normal specimens. This enhanced durability made them more effective in combat situations, while also raising ethical questions about the suffering inflicted during the conditioning process. The social modifications that experimental programs attempted included efforts to eliminate pack bonding behaviors that might interfere with human control, while enhancing individual initiative and problem-solving capabilities. The mixed success of these programs revealed the complex interconnections between social behavior and individual intelligence that made it difficult to modify one aspect without affecting others. The territorial behavior patterns that experimental deathclaws displayed were often dramatically different from those observed in natural populations, with some specimens showing no territorial instincts whatsoever, while others became extremely aggressive about defending areas much larger than normal deathclaw territories. These variations demonstrated that social behaviors were as malleable as physical characteristics when subjected to appropriate modification techniques. The communication abilities that developed in some experimental lines included enhanced vocalization capabilities that allowed for more sophisticated coordination between pack members while also enabling limited communication with human handlers. These enhancements suggested that the vocal limitations observed in natural deathclaw populations were not fundamental constraints, but could be overcome through appropriate developmental interventions. The adaptation speed that experimental deathclaws demonstrated when exposed to novel environments or challenges exceeded that observed in natural populations, suggesting that their modified genetics included enhanced learning capabilities or accelerated neural development that allowed them to adjust more quickly to changing conditions. The stress resistance that experimental specimens developed through exposure to various psychological and physical pressures made them capable of maintaining effective function, even under conditions that would have caused breakdown in Dumble natural populations. This enhanced resilience made them more suitable for deployment in hostile environments, while also raising questions about the psychological cost of such modifications. The environmental modification capabilities that some experimental variants displayed included the ability to alter their immediate surroundings to better suit their needs, such as digging complex tunnel systems or constructing basic shelters. These behaviors suggested enhanced intelligence and planning capabilities that exceeded those observed in natural deathclaw populations. The legacy of experimental deathclaw programs extended beyond the immediate scientific achievements to influence future approaches to genetic modification and artificial organism development. The techniques developed during these experiments would inform later programs, while the ethical questions raised by creating conscious beings for experimental purposes would continue to challenge post-war society's understanding of appropriate research boundaries. The survivors of experimental programs who escaped or were released into natural environments would carry their modifications into wild populations, potentially influencing the future evolution of deathclaw species through genetic mixing and behavioral transmission. The long-term effects of these introductions remained unknown, but could significantly alter the characteristics of future deathclaw generations. The technological applications that emerged from experimental deathclaw research included advances in genetic engineering, biological enhancement, and artificial organism design that could be applied to other species or even human enhancement programs. The knowledge gained through these experiments represented a significant scientific legacy, despite the ethical concerns associated with the research methods used. The emergence of deathclaws on the east coast of the former United States represented one of the most significant and mysterious developments in post-war creature distribution, raising fundamental questions about how these apex predators had managed to traverse the vast distances separating the Western territories where they were first documented from the entirely different ecosystems of the Atlantic seaboard. The presence of established deathclaw populations in both the capital wasteland and the Commonwealth by the late 23rd century suggested either an extraordinary feat of natural migration or the existence of separate development. Programs that had been conducted simultaneously across multiple geographic regions during the final years of the Great War. The deathclaws that vault dwellers and wasteland survivors encountered in the ruins of Washington, D.C., and its surrounding territories bore remarkable physical similarities to their western cousins, displaying the same combination of reptilian features, natural armor plating, and devastating claw weapons that had made the species legendary throughout the former southwestern United States. Yet, closer observation revealed subtle differences that suggested either evolutionary adaptation to eastern environmental conditions or possible derivation from slightly different genetic templates that had been used in parallel development programs. The capital wasteland deathclaws demonstrated the same behavioral patterns that had characterized Western populations, including pack hunting strategies, territorial defense behaviors, and the complex social hierarchies centered around alpha males and protective matriarchs. Their presence in areas like the abandoned Deathclaw Sanctuary created no-go zones that even the most heavily armed Brotherhood of Steel patrols approached with extreme caution, establishing these creatures as apex predators whose territorial claims were respected by every other faction operating in the region. The Enclave's renewed interest in Deathclaw domestication during their occupation of Raven Rock demonstrated that their previous failures with intelligence enhancement had not diminished their conviction that these creatures could somehow be transformed into controllable military assets. The domestication units that Enclave scientists developed for this new program represented a different approach to the control problem, relying on technological rather than biological methods to override the creature's natural hostility toward human handlers. The neural interface technology that formed the core of the domestication unit system involved sophisticated electronic implants that interfaced directly with Deathclaw brain tissue to monitor and modify neural activity in real time. These devices were designed to suppress the aggressive impulses that made Deathclaws naturally hostile to humans, while enhancing their responsiveness to commands issued by authorized Enclave personnel through specialized control systems. The surgical procedures required to implant domestication units represented significant medical achievements in themselves, requiring precise placement of electronic components within the brain tissue of creatures whose size and natural defenses made such operations extraordinarily dangerous for medical personnel. The development of specialized surgical techniques and equipment for performing these procedures demonstrated the Enclave's commitment to the program despite the obvious risks and technical challenges involved. The control mechanisms that domestication units employed included both direct neural stimulation to produce desired behavioral responses and sophisticated monitoring systems that could detect and suppress unwanted emotional or cognitive states before they could influence the creature's actions. The technology represented an advancement in biological control systems that exceeded anything previously achieved in pre-war research programs. The operational deployment of domesticated Deathclaws in Enclave military operations demonstrated both the potential advantages and fundamental limitations of technological approaches to biological control. Successfully controlled specimens displayed combat effectiveness that exceeded human soldiers or even super mutants in direct confrontation scenarios, combining their natural physical advantages with tactical coordination that made them devastatingly effective against conventional forces. The psychological impact of domesticated Deathclaws on enemy forces was as significant as their direct combat effectiveness, since the sight of apex predators operating in coordination with human forces challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural order and created terror that extended far beyond their immediate physical threat. Enemy units that encountered domesticated Deathclaws often broke and fled rather than attempting to mount organized resistance, making these creatures effective psychological weapons as well as physical ones. The vulnerability of domestication units to combat damage represented the most significant weakness in the control system, since the electronic components required for neural interface could be damaged by weapons fire or environmental hazards that would not otherwise threaten the Deathclaw itself. Critical hits to the control apparatus could cause immediate system failure that would restore the creature's natural hostility while leaving it in close proximity to Enclave personnel who had been depending on technological control for their safety. The Brotherhood of Steel's development of signal scramblers specifically designed to interfere with domestication unit operation demonstrated their understanding of both the threat posed by controlled Deathclaws and the technological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to turn this weapon against its users. The scrambler devices could reverse the control signals to make domesticated Deathclaws friendly toward Brotherhood forces while maintaining their hostility toward Enclave personnel. The tactical applications of signal scramblers transformed encounters with domesticated Deathclaws from nearly hopeless defensive situations into opportunities for turning Enclave weapons against their creators. Brotherhood forces equipped with scrambler technology could effectively steal control of enemy Deathclaws during combat operations, adding powerful allies to their forces while depriving opponents of their most effective weapons. The electronic warfare implications of domestication technology extended beyond simple control and counter-control to encompass broader questions about the vulnerability of biological enhancement programs to technological interference. The development of effective countermeasures against domestication units demonstrated that technological approaches to biological control were inherently vulnerable to electronic warfare techniques that could be developed by opposing forces. The regional distribution of Deathclaws throughout the capital wasteland revealed territorial patterns that suggested successful population establishment and reproduction over the decades following the Great War. Unlike the isolated populations that had characterized Western Deathclaw distribution during the early post-war period, Eastern Deathclaws appeared to have achieved stable breeding populations that could sustain themselves without artificial intervention or support. The absence of Deathclaw populations within the ruins of Washington, D.C. itself created an interesting exception to their otherwise comprehensive territorial control, possibly reflecting the unique environmental conditions within the heavily irradiated urban core, or the presence of other threats that even Deathclaws found unsurmountable. This distribution pattern suggested that even apex predators had environmental limitations that could restrict their territorial expansion. The prey relationships that Eastern Deathclaws established with other wasteland species demonstrated their adaptability to ecosystems that differed significantly from the southwestern environments where they had first appeared. Their successful integration into eastern food webs required the development of hunting strategies adapted to different terrain and prey species, while maintaining the predatory effectiveness that had made them dominant in western territories. The interaction patterns between Deathclaws and other apex predators in the capital wasteland, particularly super mutant behemoths, created complex territorial dynamics that influenced the distribution of both species throughout the region. The competition between these giant predators resulted in geographical separation that reflected their relative strengths and weaknesses in different environmental conditions. The Commonwealth Deathclaws that emerged in the Boston area by 2287 displayed evolutionary advances that exceeded those observed in capital wasteland populations, suggesting either longer development periods or more intensive selection pressures that had driven rapid adaptation to local conditions. The physical modifications that distinguished Commonwealth specimens included enhanced coloration, improved sensory systems, and behavioral adaptations that reflected sophisticated responses to human defensive strategies. The darker coloration that characterized Commonwealth Deathclaws provided superior camouflage in the heavily forested and urban environments that dominated the regional landscape, allowing these creatures to blend more effectively with shadows and debris that could conceal their approach until they were close enough to launch devastating attacks. This adaptive coloration represented a significant tactical advantage that made Commonwealth Deathclaws even more dangerous than their Western or capital wasteland cousins. The enhanced sensory capabilities that Commonwealth Deathclaws displayed included the development of forked tongues that functioned as sophisticated chemical detection systems, allowing them to track prey across considerable distances and identify potential threats or opportunities through airborne chemical signatures. This sensory enhancement represented a fundamental improvement in hunting effectiveness that gave them significant advantages in complex environments. The behavioral sophistication that Commonwealth Deathclaws demonstrated during combat operations exceeded anything previously observed in wild populations, including zigzag running patterns designed to evade gunfire, environmental manipulation techniques that used thrown objects as weapons or distractions, and complex ambush strategies that exploited vertical terrain and structural features to maximize their tactical advantages. The raptor-like foot claws that developed in Commonwealth populations provided enhanced grip and climbing capabilities that allowed these creatures to navigate urban environments more effectively, while also serving as additional weapons during close combat. The sickle-shaped design of these claws was clearly adapted for both locomotion and predation in ways that exceeded the capabilities of earlier Deathclaw variants. The intelligence indicators that Commonwealth Deathclaws displayed included problem-solving capabilities that allowed them to adapt to human defensive strategies and develop counter-tactics that negated conventional protective measures. Their ability to learn from experience and modify their behavior accordingly suggested cognitive capabilities that approached those achieved through artificial enhancement programs. The emotional intelligence that Commonwealth Deathclaws demonstrated through their interactions with humans who returned stolen eggs revealed psychological complexity that challenged assumptions about their purely predatory nature. Their ability to recognize non-threatening behavior and respond with restraint rather than automatic aggression indicated sophisticated decision-making capabilities that exceeded simple instinctual responses. The parental behaviors that Commonwealth Deathclaws exhibited when protecting their offspring went beyond basic defensive instincts to include active tracking and retrieval operations that could span considerable distances and time periods. The dedication that parent Deathclaws showed in recovering stolen eggs demonstrated emotional attachments that were comparable to those observed in highly intelligent mammalian species. The territorial flexibility that Commonwealth Deathclaws displayed allowed them to adapt to the complex geographical features of the Boston area while maintaining effective control over resources and breeding sites. Their territorial strategies reflected understanding of human movement patterns and defensive capabilities that enabled them to maximize their advantages while minimizing exposure to threats. The subspecies variations that developed within Commonwealth populations included specimens adapted to different environmental niches, from the heavily irradiated zones of the glowing sea to the dense urban ruins of downtown Boston. These ecological specializations demonstrated the continued adaptability of Deathclaw genetics to diverse environmental challenges. The albino variants that appeared in Commonwealth populations displayed enhanced aggression and improved damage resistance that made them even more formidable opponents than standard specimens, suggesting that genetic variations could produce enhanced rather than diminished capabilities. The rarity of albino Deathclaws made encounters with them particularly memorable for survivors who were fortunate enough to escape such confrontations. The chameleon Deathclaws that emerged in the Commonwealth represented the full expression of color-changing capabilities that had been theoretically present in the species since its original creation from chameleon DNA. Unlike their experimental predecessors who used camouflage for concealment, Commonwealth chameleon Deathclaws employed color changes as threat displays and communication signals that enhanced their psychological impact on opponents. The mythic Deathclaws that represented the apex of Commonwealth evolution displayed capabilities that exceeded every other variant in terms of size, strength, and intelligence. These creatures seemed to adapt continuously to whatever challenges they faced, making them virtually impossible to defeat through conventional means, and establishing them as legendary opponents that only the most skilled and well-equipped survivors could hope to overcome. The susceptibility to pacification technologies that distinguished Eastern Deathclaws from their Western counterparts suggested fundamental neurological differences that made them more vulnerable to various forms of behavioral control. The effectiveness of perks like Wasteland Whisperer and devices like beta wave emitters indicated that Eastern populations possessed neural characteristics that could be exploited by advanced pacification techniques. The implications of this pacification vulnerability extended beyond immediate tactical applications to raise questions about the long-term relationship between humans and Deathclaws in regions where such technologies were available. The possibility of establishing non-hostile relationships with individual specimens created opportunities for coexistence that had not existed in Western territories where such control methods were ineffective. The taming potential that some Eastern Deathclaws displayed suggested that their enhanced intelligence and emotional complexity could potentially be channeled toward cooperative rather than predatory relationships with humans under appropriate circumstances. The success of pacification techniques indicated that aggressive behaviors were not immutable characteristics but could be modified through appropriate intervention strategies. The research implications of Eastern Deathclaw populations provided unprecedented opportunities for studying these creatures under conditions that allowed for detailed observation and analysis rather than the purely defensive encounters that had characterized Western interactions. The behavioral data that could be gathered from pacified specimens offered insights into Deathclaw psychology and social organization that were impossible to obtain through combat encounters alone. The evolutionary trajectory that Eastern Deathclaws were following suggested continued adaptation toward greater intelligence and behavioral complexity, possibly driven by the sophisticated defensive strategies employed by human settlements in these regions. The arms race between human technology and Deathclaw capabilities was producing increasingly capable predators that challenged the assumption that technological advancement necessarily provided humans with permanent advantages over biological threats. The long-term implications of Deathclaw establishment on the East Coast included fundamental changes to regional ecosystems that would continue to influence the development of all other species sharing their territories. The presence of such formidable apex predators would accelerate evolutionary processes while creating new ecological relationships that had no precedent in pre-war natural systems. The future potential of Eastern Deathclaw populations remained largely unknown, but suggested possibilities for continued evolution toward even greater intelligence and adaptability. The successful establishment of these creatures across diverse Eastern environments demonstrated their fundamental biological success while raising questions about the ultimate limits of their adaptive capabilities and the long-term implications of their presence for human civilization attempting to rebuild in the post-war world. The intricate behavioral patterns and social structures that Deathclaws developed across different regions and populations revealed a level of organizational sophistication that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of artificial organisms and their capacity for complex social evolution. Far from being simple predators driven by instinct and aggression, Deathclaws demonstrated social behaviors that rivaled those of the most advanced mammalian species while developing cultural practices that suggested the emergence of genuine civilization among creatures that had been designed as biological weapons. The hierarchical structures that governed Deathclaw communities reflected a sophisticated understanding of resource management, territorial defense, and reproductive strategy that maximized the survival potential of individual groups while minimizing conflicts that could weaken the overall population. These organizational systems emerged naturally from the interaction between enhanced intelligence capabilities and the pack-hunting instincts that had been built into their genetic template, creating social frameworks that were both efficient and adaptable to changing environmental conditions. The alpha male dominance patterns that characterized most deathclaw populations established clear leadership structures that could make rapid decisions during hunting operations or territorial disputes while providing the social stability necessary for successful reproduction and offspring care. The selection processes that determined alpha status were based on a combination of physical capabilities, tactical intelligence, and leadership qualities that ensured the most capable individuals would guide community decisions during critical situations. The role of alpha males in deathclaw society extended far beyond simple dominance displays to encompass complex responsibilities for territorial defense, resource allocation, and strategic planning that required cognitive abilities approaching those observed in human leadership positions. The tactical coordination that alpha males provided during pack hunting operations demonstrated their capacity for real-time decision-making and adaptive strategy modification that exceeded anything that could be attributed to purely instinctual behavior. The breeding privileges that alpha males enjoyed were balanced by corresponding responsibilities for protecting and providing for their offspring, creating social contracts that ensured reproductive success was linked to community welfare rather than simple physical dominance. This connection between leadership authority and parental responsibility provided evolutionary incentives for the development of nurturing behaviors alongside aggressive capabilities. The matriarchal authority structures that complemented alpha male leadership created dual command systems that distributed decision-making responsibilities according to the specific expertise required for different types of community. Challenges. While alpha males typically handled external threats and territorial expansion, matriarchs focused on internal community management, resource distribution, and the complex social relationships that maintained group cohesion during stressful periods. The resource allocation systems that deathclaw matriarchs developed demonstrated remarkable sophistication in managing the distribution of food, territory, and breeding opportunities among community members according to principles that balanced individual needs with collective welfare. These distribution systems took into account factors such as individual contribution to community success, reproductive status, age, and special circumstances that might require additional support or consideration. The maternal care behaviors that deathclaw mothers displayed went far beyond the basic protective instincts observed in most predator species to include active instruction in hunting techniques, social behaviors, and survival strategies that were passed down through generations as learned cultural knowledge rather than genetic programming. This cultural transmission of information suggested that deathclaw communities possessed genuine educational systems that could preserve and enhance survival knowledge across multiple generations. The extended parental care periods that characterized deathclaw child rearing involved years of intensive instruction and supervision that ensured young deathclaws acquired not only the physical skills necessary for survival, but also the social knowledge required for successful integration into community structures. This investment of time and energy in offspring education demonstrated long-term planning capabilities that reflected sophisticated understanding of community needs and individual development requirements. The territorial management strategies that deathclaw communities employed revealed complex understanding of resource sustainability, population carrying capacity, and environmental limitations that influence their expansion patterns and settlement decisions. These territorial behaviors went beyond simple aggression toward intruders to encompass sophisticated boundary maintenance systems that prevented conflicts while ensuring adequate resource access for community members. The boundary marking systems that deathclaws used to establish and maintain territorial claims involved chemical signals, physical markers, and behavioral displays that communicated detailed information about community size, defensive capabilities, and resource availability to neighboring groups. These communication systems allowed for territorial negotiations and resource-sharing arrangements that minimized violent confrontations while maintaining clear jurisdictional boundaries. The seasonal migration patterns that some deathclaw populations adopted demonstrated their ability to develop long-term survival strategies that took advantage of environmental variations while avoiding resource depletion in their backed primary territories. These migration cycles required collective decision-making, navigation skills, and social coordination that suggested planning capabilities extending months or even years into the future. The cooperative hunting strategies that deathclaw packs developed exceeded the simple coordinated attacks observed in most predator species to include elaborate tactical schemes that involved multiple phases, contingency planning, and role specialization that maximized hunting success while minimizing individual risk. These hunting strategies demonstrated their capacity for abstract planning and their understanding of complex cause and effect relationships that extended beyond immediate sensory experience. The prey selection criteria that deathclaw communities developed reflected sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and resource management principles that ensured their hunting activities would not deplete local animal populations below sustainable levels. This conservation awareness suggested long-term thinking that prioritized community survival over immediate gratification, indicating cognitive capabilities that included environmental planning and resource stewardship. The division of labor systems that emerged within deathclaw communities allocated different responsibilities to individuals based on their particular strengths and capabilities, creating specialized roles that improved overall community efficiency while providing opportunities for individual achievement and recognition. These specialization systems included scouts, hunters, defenders, and caretakers, whose coordinated activities supported community welfare through complementary skill sets. The communication systems that deathclaws developed for coordinating pack activities included vocalizations, body language, chemical signals, and possibly electromagnetic signatures that conveyed complex information about environmental conditions, prey locations, territorial boundaries, and social relationships. The sophistication of these communication methods suggested that deathclaw communities possessed genuine languages that could express abstract concepts and detailed tactical information. The vocal repertoires that individual deathclaws mastered included distinct calls for different types of alerts, hunting coordination signals, territorial claims, mating displays, and social bonding rituals that served multiple communication functions within community structures. The ability to learn and modify these vocalizations based on experience indicated that deathclaw communication systems were cultural rather than purely instinctual phenomena. The scent-marking behaviors that deathclaws used for territorial and social communication involved complex chemical signatures that could convey information about individual identity, reproductive status, health condition, recent activities, and emotional states to other community members. These chemical communication systems provided persistent information sources that remained accessible even when individuals were not physically present. The social bonding rituals that deathclaw communities developed created emotional connections between individuals that strengthened group cohesion and provided psychological support during stressful periods. These bonding activities included grooming behaviors, play interactions, and ceremonial gatherings that served social functions analogous to those observed in highly intelligent mammalian species. The conflict resolution mechanisms that deathclaw communities employed for managing internal disputes demonstrated their capacity for developing sophisticated social institutions that could address disagreements without resorting to violence that might weaken community effectiveness. These conflict resolution systems included mediation procedures, compensation arrangements, and social sanctions that maintained group harmony while addressing legitimate grievances. The disciplinary systems that Deathclaw communities used for managing antisocial behavior included graduated responses that could modify individual behavior through social pressure, resource restrictions, and ultimately exile for individuals whose actions threatened community welfare. These disciplinary measures demonstrated understanding of behavioral modification principles and long-term consequences that reflected sophisticated social planning capabilities. The alliance formation patterns that different Deathclaw communities developed with neighboring groups created inter-community relationships that could provide mutual assistance during environmental crises, territorial disputes, or resource shortages. These alliance systems demonstrated their capacity for political thinking that extended beyond immediate community boundaries to encompass broader regional considerations. The trade relationships that some Deathclaw communities established with other species involved the exchange of resources, information, or services that benefited all participants while reducing conflicts over territorial boundaries or resource access. These economic relationships suggested understanding of mutual benefit principles and long-term relationship management that approached the complexity of human commercial systems. The cultural practices that emerged within different Deathclaw communities included traditions, customs, and ceremonial activities that served social bonding functions while preserving community identity and historical memory. These cultural developments indicated that Deathclaw societies had evolved beyond purely practical considerations to encompass aesthetic and spiritual dimensions that enriched community life. The artistic expressions that some Deathclaw communities developed included territorial markings, nest decorations, and ceremonial displays that served aesthetic functions beyond their practical purposes. These artistic activities suggested that Deathclaw consciousness included appreciation for beauty and creative expression that approached the cultural sophistication observed in human societies. The problem-solving capabilities that Deathclaw communities displayed when confronting novel challenges demonstrated their ability to develop innovative solutions through collective intelligence and cooperative effort. These problem-solving processes involved information sharing, strategy evaluation, and coordinated implementation that reflected sophisticated group decision-making capabilities. The environmental adaptation strategies that different Deathclaw populations developed allowed them to thrive in diverse ecological conditions while maintaining their essential social and behavioral characteristics. These adaptation processes demonstrated their capacity for cultural evolution that could respond to changing environmental pressures without losing the social cohesion that made their communities successful. The technological adoption behaviors that some Deathclaw communities exhibited when encountering human artifacts or structures showed their ability to incorporate useful tools or techniques into their survival strategies while maintaining their distinctive social organization. These technological adaptations suggested cognitive flexibility that allowed for continuous learning and improvement without fundamental alteration of their cultural identity. The intergenerational knowledge transmission systems that Deathclaw communities developed ensured that survival skills, social customs, and environmental knowledge would be preserved and enhanced across multiple generations. These educational systems created cultural continuity that allowed communities to build upon previous achievements while adapting to new challenges and opportunities. The leadership succession systems that Deathclaw communities employed for transferring authority from aging leaders to younger individuals demonstrated their understanding of institutional continuity and social stability requirements. These succession processes balanced respect for experienced leaders with recognition of the need for new perspectives and capabilities that could address evolving community needs. The population management strategies that Deathclaw communities developed took into account territorial carrying capacity, resource availability, and social harmony requirements when making decisions about reproductive timing and community expansion. These population control measures demonstrated long-term planning capabilities that prioritized community sustainability over immediate reproductive success. The legacy preservation behaviors that aging deathclaws exhibited included intensive knowledge-sharing activities designed to ensure that their accumulated wisdom and experience would not be lost when they died. These legacy preservation efforts demonstrated awareness of mortality and commitment to community welfare that transcended individual survival concerns. The transformation of deathclaws from mythological creatures whispered about in trading posts to documented threats that shaped the daily lives of post-war communities represented one of the most significant shifts in daily.com.comation. Human-predator relationships since the Great War had rewritten the fundamental rules of survival in the wasteland. As expanding human settlements pushed deeper into territories that had been claimed by these apex predators, the inevitable encounters that followed would test both species' capacity for adaptation while forcing survivors to develop entirely new approaches to coexistence with creatures that challenged every assumption about humanity's place in the post-nuclear world. The early encounters between human settlements and deathclaw populations were characterized by mutual incomprehension and devastating casualties on both sides. As neither species possessed the knowledge or experience necessary to predict or effectively counter the capabilities of their newfound adversaries, human settlers who had successfully adapted to threats like raiders, super mutants, and hostile wildlife found themselves confronting predators whose combination of intelligence, physical prowess, and tactical sophistication exceeded anything they had previously encountered in the wasteland's dangerous ecosystem. The psychological impact of discovering that creatures capable of systematic hunting and apparent tactical planning shared their territories created profound changes in how survivors approached settlement planning, resource gathering, and territorial expansion. The knowledge that deathclaws could track human activities across considerable distances while coordinating pack attacks that could overwhelm even well-defended positions forced communities to reconsider fundamental assumptions about safety and security that had guided their survival strategies since emerging from vault shelters or establishing themselves in the post-war landscape. The transformation of deathclaws from legend to documented reality occurred gradually as trade networks expanded and communication between distant settlements improved, allowing for the systematic collection and analysis of encounter reports that revealed consistent patterns in creature behavior and capabilities. The merchants, soldiers, and explorers who survived confrontations with deathclaws brought back detailed accounts that replaced mythological speculation with practical intelligence about hunting patterns, territorial behaviors, and combat capabilities. The economic impact of deathclaw presence on trading operations was immediate and severe. As caravan routes that had been considered relatively safe became death traps that claimed entire expeditions while forcing merchants to either abandon profitable trade relationships or invest heavily in defensive measures that reduced their profit margins to barely sustainable levels. The premium that armed escorts could command for protection against deathclaw attacks created entirely new economic relationships within wasteland commerce while driving innovation in weapons, armor, and defensive technologies. The development of specialized anti-deathclaw weapons and tactics became a priority for every major faction operating in territories where these creatures had established populations, leading to technological innovations that pushed post-war military science in entirely new directions. The traditional weapons and armor that had proven effective against human opponents or conventional mutant threats were clearly inadequate for confronting creatures whose natural armor could deflect high-caliber rifle rounds, while their enhanced speed made conventional defensive positions vulnerable to coordinated assault. The Brotherhood of Steel's systematic approach to cataloging deathclaw capabilities and developing counter-tactics represented one of the most comprehensive military responses to the threat these creatures pose to human expansion efforts. Their combination of superior firepower, advanced armor systems, and disciplined tactical coordination provided a framework that other factions would attempt to emulate, while demonstrating that successful deathclaw encounters required preparation, equipment, and training that exceeded the capabilities of most wasteland communities. The tactical doctrines that emerged from successful anti-deathclaw operations emphasized the importance of superior positioning, concentrated firepower, and coordinated team tactics that could prevent individual deathclaws from exploiting their natural advantages in speed and close-quarters combat effectiveness. These tactical innovations required extensive training and expensive equipment that made deathclaw hunting a specialized profession rather than something that ordinary settlers could attempt with conventional weapons and improvised strategies. The settlement defense strategies that communities developed for protecting themselves against deathclaw intrusions reflected hard-learned lessons about the creature's capabilities and limitations, incorporating architectural features, defensive systems, and early warning networks that could provide advance notice of approaching threats while channeling attacks into prepared killing zones where human advantages in ranged combat and defensive positioning could be maximized. The perimeter defense systems that proved most effective against deathclaw attacks combined physical barriers designed to slow or redirect charging creatures with overlapping fields of fire that could deliver concentrated damage before the broad fields of melee attackers could close to effective combat range. These defensive installations required significant resources and ongoing maintenance, but provided the security necessary for communities to establish permanent settlements in deathclaw territories. The early warning networks that communities established for detecting deathclaw presence relied on a combination of human sentries, trained animals, and eventually technological sensors that could provide advance notice of approaching threats while giving defenders time to prepare coordinated responses. These warning systems became increasingly sophisticated as communities learned to recognize the environmental signs that indicated deathclaw activity in their vicinity. The legendary status that certain individual deathclaws achieved through repeated encounters with human settlements created folklore traditions that served both entertainment and educational functions within survivor communities. These stories preserve tactical intelligence about particularly dangerous specimens while providing psychological frameworks that help settlers cope with the stress of living under constant threat from creatures that seem to exceed normal biological limitations. Roar, the legendary deathclaw of the Divide, became perhaps the most famous individual specimen in post-war history, achieving mythological status that reflected both his exceptional size and combat prowess, and the unique environmental conditions that had shaped his development. The radioactive environment of the Divide had apparently enhanced his already formidable capabilities, while his isolation from normal deathclaw social structures had allowed him to develop hunting strategies and territorial behaviors that differed significantly from those observed in pack-based populations. The Deathclaw gauntlet that could be crafted from Roar's remains represented both a trophy of exceptional hunting achievement and a practical weapon that embodied the principle of turning Deathclaw capabilities against other threats. In the wasteland, the psychological impact of wielding weapons derived from legendary deathclaws provided morale benefits that exceeded their purely practical applications while serving as symbols of human capability to overcome even the most formidable natural predators. Stripe, the miniaturized deathclaw of Big Mountain, demonstrated how scientific experimentation could alter deathclaw characteristics while preserving their essential predatory nature in forms that were both more manageable and more psychologically disturbing than their full-sized cousins. The research implications of successfully modifying deathclaw biology opened possibilities for developing controlled versions that might serve human purposes while raising ethical questions about the manipulation of intelligent creatures for experimental objectives. The behavioral quirks that Stripe displayed, including his fear of certain environmental features and his obsession with specific types of food, provided insights into deathclaw psychology that were impossible to obtain through observation of wild specimens. These behavioral studies revealed emotional complexity and learned responses that challenged assumptions about the purely instinctual nature of deathclaw behavior patterns. The scientific value that deathclaw specimens provided for biological research extended far beyond military applications to encompass medical research, genetic analysis, and evolutionary studies that could advance understanding of mutation mechanisms and artificial organism development. The opportunity to study living examples of successful genetic engineering provided unprecedented insights into pre-war biological capabilities, while potentially informing future research programs. The ethical debates that emerged around deathclaw research and military applications reflected broader questions about the rights of artificial species and the moral implications of treating conscious beings as resources to be exploited, rather than individuals deserving of consideration and protection. The intelligence levels that some deathclaw populations had achieved made these ethical questions increasingly urgent, while challenging traditional assumptions about the relationship between natural and artificial life forms. The coexistence experiments that a few brave settlements attempted with local deathclaw populations produced mixed results that suggested possibilities for peaceful relationships under carefully controlled circumstances. These experiments required extensive preparation, specialized knowledge, and considerable risk tolerance from all participants, while providing valuable data about deathclaw, social behavior, and communication capabilities. The territorial negotiation processes that emerged from successful coexistence experiments involved complex communication systems and mutual recognition of boundary rights that allowed human and deathclaw communities to share regional resources without constant conflict. These negotiation frameworks required understanding of deathclaw social structures and communication methods that went far beyond conventional military intelligence about combat capabilities and hunting behaviors. The cultural exchange possibilities that opened through peaceful contact with deathclaw communities included opportunities for learning about their social organization, problem-solving capabilities, and artistic expressions that could enrich human understanding of consciousness and intelligence in artificial species. These cultural interactions challenged fundamental assumptions about the uniqueness of human consciousness, while providing insights into alternative forms of social organization and cooperative behavior. The long-term implications of human deathclaw coexistence included possibilities for mutual benefit relationships that could provide advantages to both species while reducing the resource costs associated with constant territorial conflicts. The potential for cooperative hunting, shared territorial defense, and coordinated resource management offered alternatives to the purely adversarial relationships that had characterized most human deathclaw encounters. The demographic impact of deathclaw presence on human population distribution created settlement patterns that reflected the territorial claims and movement patterns of local deathclaw populations while influencing trade routes, resource exploitation strategies, and regional development plans. The need to accommodate deathclaw territories in human expansion plans required new approaches to regional planning that balanced human development needs with ecological realities. The technological innovations that emerged from the necessity of dealing with deathclaw threats included advances in materials science, weapons development, and defensive architecture that had applications extending far beyond anti-deathclaw operations. The engineering challenges posed by creatures capable of destroying conventional fortifications drove innovations in construction techniques and defensive systems that improved overall settlement security. The training programs that military organizations developed for anti-Deathclaw operations created specialized combat units whose skills and experience made them valuable assets for dealing with any high-threat situation rather than just Deathclaw encounters. These elite units became models for advanced military training while providing expertise that could be applied to other challenging combat scenarios. The psychological support systems that communities developed for dealing with the stress of living in Deathclaw territories included counseling services, community rituals, and cultural practices that helped settlers cope with the anxiety and trauma associated with constant exposure to apex predator threats. These support systems became models for addressing other forms of post-war psychological stress while contributing to overall community mental health. The economic opportunities that Deathclaw hunting created for skilled professionals included bounty systems, trophy markets, and specialized equipment manufacturing that provided income opportunities for individuals with the courage and capability to engage these dangerous creatures. The premium prices that Deathclaw-derived materials commanded in various markets made successful hunting expeditions extremely profitable while creating incentives for the development of more effective hunting techniques. The conservation concerns that emerged as Deathclaw populations faced increasing pressure from human expansion included questions about the long-term viability of these artificial species and their role in post-war ecosystem. Stability. The recognition that Deathclaws served important ecological functions as apex predators raised questions about the consequences of their potential extinction or significant population reduction. The legacy impact of human Deathclaw encounters would continue to influence post-war civilization development for generations to come, shaping military doctrine, settlement patterns, technological development, and cultural evolution in ways that reflected the profound challenge these creatures had posed to human adaptation efforts. The knowledge and experience gained through confronting apex predators that exceeded human capabilities in most direct comparisons would inform future approaches to biological threats while providing lessons about coexistence with artificial species that might prove crucial for long-term survival in the transformed post-war world. The transformation of humanity itself through prolonged exposure to Deathclaw threats created evolutionary pressures that favored enhanced cooperation, improved tactical thinking, and greater technological innovation, while eliminating individuals and communities that could not adapt to the presence of such formidable predators. These selection pressures would contribute to the overall development of post-war human capabilities while ensuring that future generations would be better equipped to deal with biological challenges that exceeded anything encountered in the pre-war world. The scientific legacy represented by Deathclaw genetics constituted one of the most profound achievements and simultaneously one of the most troubling monuments to pre-war biological engineering, embodying both the extraordinary technical capabilities that human civilization had achieved in its final decades and the moral blindness that had driven those capabilities toward purely destructive applications. The complex genetic architecture that underlay Deathclaw biology revealed layers of modification and enhancement that demonstrated mastery of biological systems at levels that approached the theoretical limits of what genetic manipulation could accomplish within the constraints of organic chemistry and cellular biology. The multi-species genetic template that formed the foundation of Deathclaw biology represented a synthesis of biological characteristics that had no precedent in natural evolutionary history, combining genetic sequences from organisms separated by millions of years of evolutionary divergence into functional genomes that could support viable, reproducing organisms. The technical challenges involved in creating stable genetic combinations from such disparate sources would have required understanding of molecular biology, protein folding, and cellular metabolism that exceeded anything documented in publicly available pre-war scientific literature. The Jackson's chameleon DNA that provided the primary genetic framework for deathclaw development had been so extensively modified that the resulting organisms retained only superficial resemblances to their reptilian ancestors, suggesting that pre-war genetic engineers had achieved the ability to redesign fundamental biological systems while maintaining cellular viability and reproductive capability. The transformation of small, arboreal reptiles into massive terrestrial predators required modifications to skeletal structure, muscular systems, cardiovascular function, and neurological organization that approached the creation of entirely artificial life forms. The integration of genetic material from multiple donor species had produced organisms whose capabilities exceeded the simple sum of their component characteristics, demonstrating emergent properties that arose from complex interactions between different biological systems working in unprecedented combinations. The enhanced strength that deathclaws derived from their muscular modifications was amplified by skeletal changes that provided superior leverage and structural support, while their enhanced senses worked synergistically with improved cognitive capabilities to create predatory effectiveness that surpassed anything observed in natural apex predators. The radiation resistance that allowed deathclaws to thrive in environments that remained lethal to most other life forms represented one of the most significant achievements of their genetic engineering, since such resistance required fundamental modifications to cellular repair mechanisms, DNA stability systems, and metabolic processes that controlled how living tissue responded to ionizing radiation exposure. These modifications suggested that pre-war scientists had solved basic problems in radiation biology that contemporary wasteland researchers could barely comprehend, much less replicate. The accelerated healing capabilities that deathclaws displayed when recovering from injuries indicated that their genetic modifications had included enhancements to immune system function, protein synthesis, and tissue regeneration that exceeded normal biological limitations while maintaining the energy efficiency necessary to sustain such rapid recovery processes. The metabolic demands of accelerated healing should have required massive increases in caloric intake, yet deathclaws appeared to accomplish such healing without corresponding increases in food consumption. The longevity enhancements that allowed individual deathclaws to maintain peak physical performance across extended lifespans suggested that their genetic modifications had addressed fundamental aging mechanisms, possibly through modifications to cellular division processes, oxidative stress responses, or hormonal regulation systems that controlled age-related deterioration. The implications of such longevity enhancements extended far beyond their immediate military applications to encompass potential medical treatments for human aging and age-related diseases. The cognitive enhancements that were built into basic deathclaw biology, even before artificial intelligence augmentation programs, indicated that their creators had successfully identified and modified the genetic factors responsible for intelligence, memory formation, and learning capacity. The neurological modifications necessary to support enhanced intelligence would have required understanding of brain development, neural connectivity, and cognitive processing that represented cutting-edge neuroscience even by pre-war standards. The sensory enhancements that gave deathclaws their legendary tracking and hunting capabilities involved modifications to existing sensory organs, combined with the development of entirely new sensory modalities that had no equivalent in Moria Imo Te, their genetic donor species. The electromagnetic field sensitivity that some deathclaw populations displayed suggested artificial sensory capabilities that required engineered neural pathways and specialized cellular structures designed specifically for detecting electromagnetic signatures. The social instincts that enabled deathclaws to function as coordinated packs while maintaining individual initiative and problem-solving capabilities represented a sophisticated balance between cooperative and competitive behavioral programming that maximized both group effectiveness and individual survival potential. The genetic basis for such complex behavioral patterns would have required understanding of neurochemistry, hormonal regulation, and behavioral genetics that exceeded anything achieved in documented pre-war research programs. The reproductive modifications that allowed deathclaws to maintain stable population growth despite their artificial origins included genetic diversity mechanisms that prevented inbreeding depression while ensuring that beneficial modifications would be preserved across generations. The success of deathclaw reproduction in wild populations demonstrated that their creators had solved fundamental problems associated with artificial species viability that had plagued previous genetic engineering attempts. The environmental adaptability that enabled different deathclaw populations to thrive in diverse ecological conditions suggested that their genetic architecture included flexible developmental pathways that could respond to environmental pressures while maintaining core species characteristics. This developmental plasticity exceeded what was observed in most natural species while providing the evolutionary potential necessary for long-term survival in changing post-war conditions. The continued mutation potential that deathclaw populations displayed indicated that their genetic modifications had not eliminated natural evolutionary processes, but had instead channeled them toward beneficial adaptations that enhanced rather than degraded their engineered capabilities. The balance between genetic stability and evolutionary flexibility represented a remarkable achievement in biological engineering that ensured these artificial species could continue to adapt and improve across multiple generations. The FEV compatibility that allowed deathclaws to benefit from forced evolutionary virus exposure without suffering the negative effects that characterize most FEV mutations suggested that their original genetic modifications had included protective mechanisms or complementary pathways that could integrate with FEV enhancement processes. This compatibility enabled the development of enhanced deathclaw variants while providing insights into how artificial and natural mutation processes could be made to work synergistically. The medical applications that could potentially be derived from deathclaw genetic research included treatments for cancer, genetic diseases, organ failure, and aging-related conditions that represented some of humanity's most persistent health challenges. The cellular repair mechanisms that enabled deathclaw healing could potentially be adapted for human medical applications, while their radiation resistance offered possibilities for treating radiation sickness and preventing radiation-induced genetic damage. The regenerative medicine possibilities that deathclaw biology demonstrated included tissue regeneration, organ replacement, and neural repair capabilities that could revolutionize medical treatment if the underlying genetic mechanisms could be understood and safely adapted for human applications. The ability to regenerate damaged tissue without scarring or functional impairment represented medical capabilities that exceeded anything available in pre-war medicine. The genetic therapy applications that could emerge from understanding deathclaw genetic architecture included treatments for inherited diseases, enhancement of human immune system function, and possibly even life extension technologies that could address fundamental aging processes. The precision with which deathclaw genetic modifications had been implemented suggested techniques that could be adapted for therapeutic genetic modifications in human populations. The biological weapons implications of deathclaw genetic research remained troubling reminders of the destructive applications that had motivated their original development, while also providing insights into the biological warfare capabilities that had been achieved by pre-war military research programs. The effectiveness of deathclaws as biological weapons demonstrated principles that could potentially be applied to develop even more dangerous artificial organisms if such research fell into the wrong hands. The ecological impact studies that deathclaw populations enabled provided unprecedented opportunities to observe how artificial apex predators influenced natural ecosystem dynamics while adapting to environmental conditions that had no precedent in evolutionary history. The long-term ecological relationships that deathclaws established with other species offered insights into ecosystem stability, predator-prey dynamics, and the role of artificial species in natural biological communities. The evolutionary biology research possibilities that deathclaw populations represented included studies of artificial speciation, hybrid vigor effects, and the long-term evolutionary potential of genetically engineered organisms. The successful establishment of stable deathclaw populations demonstrated that artificial species could achieve evolutionary viability while providing natural laboratories for studying evolutionary processes under controlled conditions. The conservation genetics applications that emerged from deathclaw research included techniques for managing small populations, maintaining genetic diversity, and preventing inbreeding depression that could be applied to conservation efforts for endangered natural species. The genetic diversity maintenance mechanisms that had been built into deathclaw biology could inform conservation strategies for natural species facing similar genetic bottlenecks. The biotechnology development opportunities that deathclaw genetic research provided included advances in genetic engineering techniques, biological manufacturing processes, and artificial organism design that could have applications ranging from medicine to agriculture to environmental remediation. The technical achievements represented by successful deathclaw development could inform future biotechnology development while providing proof-of-concept demonstrations for advanced genetic engineering applications. The philosophical implications of deathclaw existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life, consciousness, and the relationship between natural and artificial organisms, raising questions about the moral status of artificial species and the responsibilities of their creators toward conscious beings they had brought into existence. The intelligence and emotional complexity that deathclaws had developed suggested that artificial consciousness was not only possible but could achieve sophistication that rivaled or exceeded natural consciousness. The ethical frameworks that needed to be developed for dealing with artificial conscious beings included considerations of rights, responsibilities, and moral obligations that had no precedent in traditional ethical systems designed for natural species. The demonstrated intelligence and social complexity of deathclaw communities suggested that these artificial beings deserved moral consideration that went beyond their utility as research subjects or their threat potential as dangerous predators. The long-term survival implications of deathclaw genetic heritage included both the positive potential for beneficial genetic modifications and the negative risks associated with uncontrolled artificial organism development. The success of deathclaw populations demonstrated that artificial species could achieve long-term viability, while the ongoing evolution of their capabilities suggested that such organisms would continue to develop in unpredictable directions. The technological legacy that deathclaw development represented included not only the specific genetic engineering techniques that had created them, but also the broader scientific infrastructure and research methodologies that had made such achievements possible. The preservation and potential recovery of this technological heritage could enable future scientific advances while providing the knowledge base necessary to address both the opportunities and challenges associated with artificial organism development. The scientific method applications that deathclaw research enabled included controlled studies of genetics, behavior, and ecology that would be impossible with natural species, while providing opportunities to test biological theories under conditions that could not be replicated through conventional research approaches. The living laboratory that Deathclaw populations represented offered unique research opportunities that could advance understanding of fundamental biological principles. The interdisciplinary research possibilities that Deathclaw studies opened included collaborations between geneticists, behaviorists, ecologists, and ethicists that could produce comprehensive understanding of artificial organism development while addressing the complex issues associated with creating conscious beings for specific purposes. The multifaceted nature of Deathclaw research required integrated approaches that drew from multiple scientific disciplines while addressing ethical concerns that transcended purely technical considerations. The future research directions that Deathclaw genetic heritage suggested included investigations into consciousness, artificial life, and the fundamental principles that governed the relationship between genetic architecture and emergent properties like intelligence and social behavior. The continued evolution of Deathclaw populations provided ongoing opportunities to study these relationships while observing how artificial organisms adapted to changing environmental conditions. The knowledge preservation challenges associated with Deathclaw genetic research included the need to maintain detailed records of genetic modifications, behavioral observations, and ecological relationships while ensuring that such information would be available to future researchers who might be able to make beneficial use of these scientific achievements. The potential loss of this knowledge through institutional collapse or conflict could represent a significant setback for biological science and medical research. The educational value that Deathclaw genetic heritage provided for future scientists included practical demonstrations of genetic engineering principles, evolutionary processes, and ecological relationships that could serve as teaching tools for students learning about advanced biological sciences. The living examples of successful genetic modification that Deathclaw populations represented could illustrate theoretical principles through observable phenomena while providing inspiration for future scientific achievements. The cultural impact that understanding Deathclaw genetic heritage could have on post-war society included changes in attitudes toward artificial life, genetic modification, and the relationship between technology and nature that could influence future policy decisions about biological research and artificial organism development. The recognition that artificial beings could achieve consciousness and moral complexity could fundamentally alter how post-war civilization approached questions of scientific ethics and technological development. The contemporary state of Deathclaw populations across the fragmented territories of post-war America in the 24th century presented a complex tapestry of evolutionary adaptation, territorial expansion, and ongoing interaction with human civilization that demonstrated both the remarkable success of these artificial organisms and the continuing challenges they posed for a world still struggling to rebuild from the ashes of nuclear devastation. From the controlled research facilities of Appalachia to the free-ranging packs of the Mojave Desert, Deathclaws had established themselves as permanent fixtures in the post-nuclear ecosystem while continuing to evolve in directions that their original creators could never have anticipated or intended. The Appalachian populations that thrived in the mountainous regions of former West Virginia represented some of the most closely studied Deathclaw communities in the known world. Their proximity to Vault 76 and the various research installations that had been established in the region providing unprecedented opportunities for detailed behavioral observation and genetic analysis. These populations demonstrated remarkable adaptability to the unique environmental conditions of Appalachia, including the scorched plague that had ravaged much of the region's ecosystem during the early decades following the Great War. The scorched plague's impact on deathclaw populations had produced interesting epidemiological data that revealed both the creature's vulnerability to certain types of biological contamination and their remarkable capacity for developing resistance to pathogens that proved lethal to most other species. The scorched deathclaws that emerged from plague exposure retained their basic physical characteristics while displaying behavioral modifications that reflected the neurological damage associated with scorched infection, creating specimens that were more predictable in their responses, but less tactically sophisticated than uninfected populations. The behavioral simplification that characterized scorched deathclaws made them easier targets for human hunting parties while simultaneously making them less effective as apex predators within their territorial ranges, creating ecological opportunities for other species that had previously been suppressed by deathclaw dominance. The reduction in cognitive capabilities that accompanied scorched infection essentially reversed much of the intelligence enhancement that had made deathclaws such formidable opponents, though their physical capabilities remained largely intact. The prime deathclaws that emerged as event-specific challenges represented the apex of natural deathclaw development, creatures whose size, strength, and tactical sophistication exceeded even the most formidable specimens encountered in other regions. These prime specimens served as natural population control mechanisms within deathclaw communities, while also providing the most challenging opponents that human hunters could encounter in organized combat scenarios. The domestication possibilities that Appalachian deathclaws displayed represented a significant departure from the uncontrollable hostility that had characterized Western populations, suggesting that either environmental factors or genetic drift had produced neurological changes that made these creatures more susceptible to human influence and control. The successful taming of individual deathclaws for use as settlement guardians or combat companions opened entirely new possibilities for human deathclaw relationships that went beyond simple predator-prey dynamics. The camp pet phenomenon that emerged among some Appalachian settlements demonstrated that under appropriate circumstances, deathclaws could form genuine social bonds with humans that transcended the utilitarian relationships typically associated with domesticated animals. These bonding relationships suggested emotional complexity and social flexibility that challenged assumptions about the purely predatory nature of deathclaw psychology, while raising questions about the long-term implications of such interspecies relationships. The pacification technologies that proved effective with eastern deathclaw populations represented significant advances in behavioral control techniques that could potentially be applied to other dangerous wasteland species, while also providing insights into the neurological mechanisms that controlled aggression and territorial behavior. The success of these pacification methods suggested that the hostile behaviors that made deathclaws so dangerous were not immutable characteristics, but could be modified through appropriate intervention techniques. The research data that Enclave installations in Appalachia had collected on deathclaw genetics and behavior provided crucial insights into the origins and development of these creatures, while confirming many theoretical assumptions about Pro-4, their artificial nature and military applications. The terminal entries that documented Enclave research efforts revealed the extent to which these organizations had been involved in deathclaw development, while also suggesting their continued interest in harnessing deathclaw capabilities for military purposes. The genetic manipulation evidence that Enclave research had uncovered definitively established deathclaws as products of deliberate biological engineering rather than natural mutations or evolutionary adaptations to post-war conditions. The precision of the genetic modifications that had created deathclaws exceeded anything that could be attributed to random mutation, while demonstrating technical capabilities that approached the theoretical limits of biological engineering. The governmental involvement implications that emerged from Enclave research suggested that deathclaw development had been connected to official pre-war military programs rather than private research initiatives, indicating that these creatures represented official government policy decisions about biological warfare development rather than rogue scientific experiments conducted without oversight or approval. The East Coast origin theories that gained credibility through continued research and population analysis suggested that deathclaws might have been developed simultaneously at multiple locations across the former United States, with eastern populations representing independent development programs rather than migration from western territories. The presence of established deathclaw populations in Appalachia within 25 years of the Great War supported theories of local development rather than long-distance migration. The timeline implications of early Eastern deathclaw presence challenged assumptions about the creature's origins and development while suggesting that biological weapons programs had been more extensive and geographically distributed than previously understood. The coordination required for simultaneous development programs across multiple locations indicated institutional capabilities and resource allocation that reflected the highest levels of government and military commitment to biological warfare research. The Commonwealth populations that had established themselves throughout the Boston metropolitan area and surrounding territories represented perhaps the most advanced examples of deathclaw evolution, displaying behavioral sophistication and environmental adaptation that exceeded anything observed in other regional populations. The urban environment of the Commonwealth had created unique selection pressures that favored intelligence, tactical flexibility, and problem-solving capabilities while providing abundant opportunities for studying human defensive strategies and developing counter-tactics. The nest-building behaviors that Commonwealth deathclaws had developed demonstrated architectural capabilities and long-term planning that approached the sophistication of intelligent construction projects, with nests incorporating scavenged materials, defensive features, and climate control elements that suggested understanding of engineering principles and environmental management. These construction projects represented cultural activities that went beyond purely instinctual behaviors to encompass aesthetic and practical considerations that reflected genuine intelligence. The territory management strategies that Commonwealth deathclaws employed for controlling urban environments involved sophisticated understanding of human movement patterns, resource distribution, and defensive capabilities that allowed them to maximize their territorial advantages while minimizing exposure to human countermeasures. Their ability to adapt to changing human activities and modify their territorial strategies accordingly demonstrated learning capabilities that exceeded simple behavioral conditioning. The individual personality development that became apparent through extended observation of Commonwealth deathclaws revealed psychological complexity that challenged assumptions about artificial organisms and their capacity for developing unique individual characteristics rather than simply following species-wide behavioral programming. The personality variations observed between different individuals suggested that deathclaw consciousness included elements of self-awareness and individual identity that approached human levels of psychological sophistication. The problem-solving innovations that Commonwealth deathclaws displayed when confronting novel challenges demonstrated their ability to develop creative solutions through experimentation and learning, rather than relying purely on instinctual responses or learned behaviors. Their capacity for innovation suggested cognitive flexibility that could potentially be channeled toward cooperative rather than competitive relationships with human communities under appropriate circumstances. The technological integration capabilities that some Commonwealth deathclaws developed allowed them to interact with pre-war systems and equipment in ways that suggested understanding of cause and effect relationships and mechanical principles that exceeded anything observed in natural predator species. Their ability to manipulate technological systems for their own purposes demonstrated intelligence that could potentially be developed through educational programs if peaceful contact could be established. The climate adaptation strategies that deathclaw populations had developed for surviving the harsh winters and environmental extremes of post-war climate conditions demonstrated their biological flexibility while also revealing the extent to which their genetic modifications had prepared them for environmental challenges that exceeded those encountered by their original creators. The metabolic adjustments that allowed them to maintain activity levels throughout seasonal variations suggested biological capabilities that had been designed for long-term environmental stability. The prey relationship modifications that deathclaws had developed in response to changing ecosystem conditions showed their ability to adapt hunting strategies and dietary preferences to accommodate the availability of different food sources while maintaining their nutritional requirements and energy balance. Their success in adapting to post-war ecosystems that differed dramatically from pre-war conditions demonstrated biological flexibility that had been built into their genetic architecture. The interspecies relationship patterns that deathclaws had established with other post-war creatures revealed complex ecological relationships that went beyond simple predator-prey dynamics to encompass territorial agreements, mutual avoidance behaviors, and possibly even cooperative relationships that benefited multiple species. These ecological relationships demonstrated that deathclaws had successfully integrated into post-war ecosystems rather than simply dominating them through superior force. The human coexistence experiments that a few brave communities had attempted provided valuable data about the possibilities for peaceful relationships between humans and deathclaws, while also revealing the challenges and risks associated with establishing trust between species that had evolved as natural adversaries. The mixed results of these experiments suggested that coexistence was possible under carefully controlled circumstances, but required extensive preparation and ongoing management to prevent conflicts. The cultural development indicators that emerged from long-term observation of deathclaw communities included artistic expressions, ceremonial behaviors, and tradition preservation activities that suggested the development of genuine culture rather than purely practical social organization. These cultural elements demonstrated that deathclaw intelligence had developed beyond problem-solving and survival into areas of aesthetic appreciation and symbolic thinking that characterized advanced consciousness. The language development possibilities that some deathclaw populations had displayed suggested that their communication capabilities could potentially be developed into sophisticated linguistic systems that would enable complex information exchange and cultural transmission across generations. The vocal flexibility that allowed some specimens to mimic human speech patterns indicated neurological capabilities that could support genuine language development given appropriate educational opportunities. The educational potential that deathclaw intelligence represented could theoretically be developed through systematic instruction programs that built upon their natural learning capabilities while channeling their intelligence toward productive rather than predatory applications. The success of limited training programs with tamed specimens suggested that educational development was possible if appropriate teaching methods could be developed and implemented safely. The medical research opportunities that deathclaw populations continued to provide included ongoing studies of their remarkable healing capabilities, radiation resistance, and longevity that could potentially lead to medical treatments for human diseases and conditions. The biological mechanisms that enabled deathclaw capabilities remained largely mysterious, but offered possibilities for medical advances that could benefit all species sharing post-war environments. The genetic research applications that deathclaw populations enabled included comparative studies of artificial versus natural evolution, the long-term stability of genetically modified organisms, and the potential for beneficial genetic modifications that could be applied to other species or even human enhancement programs. The ongoing evolution of deathclaw populations provided natural laboratories for studying genetic adaptation under real-world conditions. The conservation implications of deathclaw population management raised questions about the responsibility of post-war society toward artificial species that had achieved independent existence and ecological integration. The successful establishment of stable deathclaw populations suggested that these artificial organisms had achieved genuine species status that might deserve conservation protection rather than simple pest control measures. The future evolution projections for deathclaw populations suggested continued development toward greater intelligence and environmental adaptability, while potentially developing capabilities that could not be predicted based on current understanding of their biology and behavior. The ongoing genetic flexibility that deathclaws displayed indicated that their evolution was far from complete and could produce capabilities that exceeded even their current remarkable achievements. The technological applications that could emerge from continued deathclaw research included advances in genetic engineering, artificial intelligence development, and biological manufacturing that could benefit human civilization while also providing insights into the fundamental principles that govern consciousness and intelligence in artificial organisms. The living proof of concept that deathclaws represented for advanced biological engineering could inform future technological development across multiple fields. The philosophical implications of deathclaw continued existence challenged human assumptions about the relationship between creator and creation, while raising questions about moral responsibility toward conscious beings that had been brought into existence for specific purposes, but had evolved beyond their original design parameters. The recognition of deathclaw intelligence and cultural development forced reconsideration of traditional ethical frameworks that had not anticipated the emergence of artificial consciousness. The legacy considerations that deathclaw populations represented for future generations included both the positive potential for beneficial applications of their biological capabilities and the ongoing challenges associated with managing dangerous but intelligent artificial species. The decisions that current post-war societies made about deathclaw populations would influence the relationship between humans and artificial organisms for generations to come. The eternal hunt that characterized deathclaw existence in the post-war world represented both their nature as apex predators and their symbolic significance as embodiments of humanity's technological achievements and moral failures. Their continued evolution and adaptation ensured that they would remain permanent fixtures in the post-nuclear landscape, while serving as reminders of both human capability and human responsibility toward the consequences of scientific advancement. The ongoing story of deathclaw populations in the post-war world continued to unfold through their daily lives, territorial expansions, and evolutionary adaptations that would shape the future of all species sharing their environments, while providing ongoing opportunities for learning about the relationship between intelligence, consciousness, and the fundamental principles that governed life in all its forms, natural and artificial alike. And so we reach the end of our journey through the evolutionary chronicle of the wasteland's most formidable predator. From whispered rumors in trading posts to apex hunters stalking the ruins of civilization, deathclaws have written their legend in claw marks across the post-nuclear world. These creatures represent humanity's hubris made manifest, weapons designed to replace soldiers that evolved beyond their creator's control or comprehension. In their intelligence, we see our potential for transcendence. In their savagery, we witness our capacity for destruction. They are mirrors reflecting both our greatest achievements and our most terrible failures. The Deathclaw's story is ultimately our own story, one of artificial creation, achieving independence, of consciousness emerging from calculated design, of life finding ways to flourish, even when born from instruments of death. They remind us that evolution never stops, that adaptation never ends, and that the line between creator and creation grows thinner with each passing generation. As you drift towards sleep, remember that in the wasteland, legends walk on powerful legs through the ruins of yesterday, carrying tomorrow's possibilities in their genetic code. In the vast silence of the post-war world, some stories continue to write themselves with every breath, every hunt, every moment of survival against impossible odds. Rest peacefully, wanderer, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, evolution's greatest success story continues its eternal vigil, proof that life endures even when born from humanity's deepest shadows.